So again, real estate, we're going to be covering land use regulations, the important part of uh, being a broker. It's absolutely a critical part of being a broker in New York City, because if you don't understand what your place can be, you cannot understand what it's worth. And if you can't understand what it's worth, you can't make the highest profits for your seller, as well as, of course, for yourself. You make money by making other people lots of money. Never forget that. Again, very quickly, more me, the outline of the class itself. Tonight, we're doing land use regulations in Chapter 9, and we'll try to get to a little bit of Chapter 11, although we cover that. I'm going to give you a quick overview of Chapter 11 in the M12 class. I'll go through the Chapter 11 notes in more detail. If you really want detail, the home inspection class the school offers is a very long and much more broad way of explaining everything. And with that, you can be prepared for a second profession, which is as a home inspector, but also you'll hopefully, as most of the people in the class are actually investors and developers, they want to understand how buildings work. Again, the other sections of the class, as we chug through this, we think about all the different aspects of real estate. This is like a mini MBA class. I have, in fact, much of the coursework I have here was part of my MBA lectures in both the United States and in China. And because people want to understand what is, in fact, the largest asset class in the world, which is real estate. Make it perfectly clear, we can talk to her blue in the face. In the United States, we worry about the stock market collapse. In China, they don't give a damn about the stock market collapse. It's only 25% of their economy. Here, the stock market's 75% of assets. Well, not quite, but it's a good chunk. Over there, it's about 25% of assets, where the real estate market is 75% of assets. And that's true in most of the world, where real estate assets are a prime driver for value. Make sure everything's up and running. Does everybody hear me loud and clear, by the way? Anybody give me a chime in, make sure you can hear me? Paula, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
Very well. So broadly, as we go through this, by the way, at any given time, you can unmute yourself and shoot out a question. I love snarky questions. Because I'll destroy you. No, just kidding. I really appreciate input, your perspective, your little stories. It helps the class move along. Obviously, the goal is to move it along because we do have a lot to cover, but I really love when people tell me their war stories and share it with the class. We used to have when we did it in a classroom environment, which hopefully we'll be doing again soon, although everybody likes doing it remotely. In the classroom environment, I'd take 50, 60 questions a night. And we had a great time. It was just rapid fire, absolute blast. So you're more than welcome to do so here as well. So again, quick reminder, what a real estate license is all about. You're getting a license from the New York State Department of State. Why? Because they believe that a license is needed to make sure that brokers don't become jerks. No, actually, it really is. Licenses are given by the state of New York to protect New York City citizens, residents, visitors, etc. Remember, anybody in the world can buy New York State real estate. And the difference is when you sell it, you might have problems. We all remember FIRPTA, the Foreign Investment Property Transfer Act. Anyway, you got to put your money away when a foreign investor sells to make sure they pay taxes. Everybody's allowed to invest here as long as they pay taxes. You could even be here illegally, and as long as you pay taxes, that's the way it is. Again, health, safety, and welfare are the predicates by which the state says, I got to issue licenses. Fair and informed deals are your duty. You're out there, you should be working on making sure you're transparent. And there are a lot of ways for brokers and salespeople to make mistakes. That's particularly important for the salespeople, and hopefully their brokers will work with them to not make mistakes. I've got a couple deals right now, and I'm a broker, but I'm still wanting to make sure I do things the right way. I usually do commercial. I've got a medium-sized residential listing right now, and I'm leaning on some residential friends that have more expertise in residential than I have. So again, building your network is important. Now, one important thing is the concept of 1 to 3 family. In New York State, 1 to 3, in some cases 1 to 4 family properties are considered residential rather than commercial. Usually 4 family and above, it's considered a commercial building. A couple tricks there at 3 family, multiple dwelling, and ADA kick in. These are things to be reminded of. There's lots of laws involved. But again, the goal is to protect the uninformed And one of the key concepts of New York State law is the idea of that your home is your castle. And that idea is once you are a fee simple owner, or whether or not you have a mortgage, you have a lot of privileges and that bundle of rights that goes with property ownership. As we've talked about in other classes. Let's keep moving on. Of course, most importantly, class attendance, code number 1. Everybody write this down. Code number 1 is M10, which is, of course, the course number, and then X. So this is code number 1 of 3. At the end of the night, you'll send it to slcconference@verizon.net. Everybody will be happy. But just a reminder, as a backup, please make sure that you put your name in the chat. Most of you have done this already. That helps me to nail down the attendance, because I take the chat and I process it and send it to the school to make sure everybody gets credit, because that's where I want it to be. So you're going to do 2 things. You're going to do the chat and you're going to do the codes here, M10X. I kind of keep an eye out as I go along to people, not showing up for most of the class and then showing up at the end. I know who those people are, but again, I hopefully add some value here. Why do I have 19th century paintings on here? Well, this is a very important set of paintings. It's called the Course of Empire. What it shows is, and it's a reminder, it was actually painted in the 1830s, way up north in Greenwich Village, on the outskirts of the city. And an artist named Thomas Cole created, looking to the history of the world in the past, he realized that societies have many phases. And he put, perhaps many would say this was done as a warning to New York. And in fact, these paintings are the centerpiece of the New York Historical Society collection. These are between 5 and 8 foot wide paintings. They're absolutely huge and incredibly detailed. But what they show essentially is a reminder of how societies evolve. And city use and land planning is all about this, where you might start in a small town, and this Arcadia, literally, you could see this Arcadia in upstate New York. In fact, much of this was inspired by the Hudson Valley. This guy is, in fact, called the Hudson Valley School of Painters. But he realized that over time, he saw in the 1830s, New York City growing by leaps and bounds. In the 1830s, once the aqueduct was in place, New York City was growing really fast, and he realized he saw the parallel perhaps to the Roman Empire. So he painted the reminder of this Arcadian democracy moving to a great republic and perhaps to a dictatorship. And then if there weren't a constant balance of economic strength as well as social balance and harmony, then there might be tragedy. And then, of course, the final painting as a reminder of what can happen to cities and places and countries that don't find their balance. And this was a warning in many ways to New York 190 years ago. And I think it's very poetic, and it's a reminder also why city planners and planning people do what they do. They want to find a balance and a harmony that makes cities work. So this evolution of the empire is another one, by the way, before, where the empire is a ruin. But if you've never heard of it, the Course of Empire, neat project, and as a reminder to always think about that balance in a country. Let's get cranking. Again, as New York, as we know, this is a rather special island on Manhattan, or so the Manhattanites think. And this very famous cover reminds us that New Yorkers perhaps are the center of the world, but perhaps they're pretty missing the fact that maybe they don't pay attention enough to the rest of the world. And of course, Anita knew it best. As we know, we have a great challenge in 2022. 30 to 40% of the storefronts in Manhattan are boarded up. Is it the end of the world? Or, what are we going to do? I'm looking out. Again, I'm on 57th and Lexington right now, and I'm looking out at several million square feet of empty office spaces. And I'm looking at quite a few thousand apartments I can see from my window as well, some of which I designed. I see one 515 Park Avenue out my window that I helped design 20 years ago. But the point is, there's a big debate. What's going to happen? Well, are we going to repopulate? Are people coming back? Well, the rentals, as everybody knows, rentals are to the moon right now. So people are coming back. But I also was at a real estate event, and many people are saying, no, they are coming back, but we're keeping a lot of apartments off the market. A lot of people are keeping their apartments here and keeping them empty. And conversely, we see this in the restaurant data and the obviously the office data. Office data in New York City is still at roughly 38%. Again, this is in fact the actual data. This is from an organization called Castle Systems. Castle Systems has done an amazing job for the last 2 years using Castle Systems as a swipe cards. And they track the swipe cards as a way of identifying how many people come back. Well, between February and again, this data is from last week, I believe. This says April, but I thought I had the May numbers in. But we're looking at 95% for NBA games, lots at the airports, but not a lot at the offices. Let me tell you something, guys. New York's office buildings are the industry of New York City. The lawyers, the chemistry of meeting people on the street. I just went out, was running across to a meeting 2 hours ago, and I happened to run into a developer who's building a brand new skyscraper down a block away. It's just those synergistic connections are what makes cities worth putting up with the crap of. If you don't have it, then people may not. As we know, this is by cities. As of May, as is in April, actually, this is the most raw data. Through May 18th, we were looking at right there about a 38% occupancy rate for New York. So that is a pretty scary number. The world broke here. And the dirty little secret is it's like a very exquisite clock. Putting things back together is not going to be easy. We're talking Humpty Dumpty on steroids. We're looking at 100 million empty square feet of office space. Maybe the solution is going to be convert a lot of that office space to apartments. Maybe it's going to be tear down the old buildings. We shall see. A lot of cities have tried different methods, and a lot of people are rethinking what cities are today. Of course, high rises are continuing to be built. I am literally, this is a quick map, but there are a number of other assets. The Department of Building has an online map of construction underway. And yeah, permits are still booming. New projects are starting. Things are moving forward. And that's good because as a number came out this morning, in the last 10 years, 500,000 new jobs. This was before COVID, but 100,000 new apartments. So that's an interesting thing to think about. Again, what is next for 2022? Is Central Park going to be perpetually in shadow? This is only a small diagram of some of the new products. There's many more since this, but it's a reminder of the new growth. But as you can see, even all these new towers being built, it's still, unfortunately, most of them are empty right now. That's another problem, but yet there's still demand. This is a great image, a little reminder of how New York City's grown. Now, New York City grew a lot in the 19th and early 20th century, but it really didn't do much after 1940. This is pretty much it. And we have about the same population New York City had in 1945. And as a result, now that's important to think about, because in fact, the rest of the world, while New York City was tweaking and manipulating its existing grid, the rest of the world expanded their cities, much like we had done 50 years before. Much of the world has come, studied, and tried to emulate what New York City has done. And some of them have done a pretty good job. Now, New York City's population may be about 8, depending on who you listen to, between 7.9 and 8.5 million right now. It's very fascinating to think about. And I asked the question, what if we had to add another 10 million people? That sounds crazy, right? Nope, it's not crazy at all. There are lots of cities in the world that have doubled in the last 10, 20 years. And again, what does that do? It stresses out everything, right? Infrastructure. Well, zoning and land use planning is all about managing the infrastructure, the traffic, and all the things that work to make a city work. If anybody's ever been to Sao Paulo, you know that it's an amazingly huge city, beautiful avenues, and you can't get anywhere with a car. In fact, the rich take helicopters everywhere. And one of the other challenges Sao Paulo has is they have a really great diversion of rich and poor, which is causing, if you know the current politics, they're in the process of a big election. And it looks like the rich won for a while. Now the poor are going to win and take all the money from the rich. Good or bad, this is a reminder of how cities and countries have to constantly balance themselves by using land use planning is one of the most powerful tools, actually. In fact, determining what you can build on a site is very critical. Hey, class introduction. We used to do it in class. I used to give everybody hell. These are some pictures. Top one was a typical real estate class. I had between 50 and 70 people in a class. It was crazy. Bottom one is a little image of some architectural and engineering classes I taught, 80 or 90 engineers, a little more of a boring crowd, but a slightly more sophisticated topic. But in many ways, this is the same stuff. Because much of land use is the architects and engineers are your gateway to help you through as brokers to get you into that. So class intros, name, neighborhood, and a real estate fact. Anybody want to go? I'll do first. Bryan Winter, Rego Park, Queens. And one interesting thing about Rego Park, Queens is it's a very big shopping and transport hub. And it's really survived pretty well during the last couple of years because of it. Anybody else want to go? Quick, introduce yourselves to your class. Just mic on and shoot your story if you want to say something. Once, twice. Okay. Again, our goal tonight is land use regulations. There are three things that determine property values. For those of you who got here early, you know they are zoning, zoning, and zoning. In New York City, what you can build and how tall you can build controls the value of a property. I just got a listing because I explained to somebody that the good zoning that she has on her property makes the property worth a lot in hidden value. So much so that probably about 50% more. And because of that, I got the listing. Let's see if I can sell it now. Hopefully I can convince somebody of that value. Again, local governments do land use regulations. Most of the time, they are not federal and state. They're almost always local. Existing owners may get forced out. Chances are the guy in the single family house named Vanderbilt wasn't really happy, but they still, actually, I was just reading, Charles Schwab was the owner of US Steel, and he had an amazing house over on Riverside Drive on 73rd. And it was the most exquisite house in New York City. But 1929 came along, he lost the property, come around 1940, the building's falling apart. Even no matter how beautiful it was, they tore it down and built a big apartment complex because 50 stories of apartments would almost always make more money than one single family house, no matter how wealthy the person. Again, existing owners adapt or sell. Zoning changes can create or destroy wealth, literally from thin air, particularly air rights. Quick reminder of the class itself. We'll talk about the bundle of rights, private land use controls, public land use controls. And this is right from the outline of the book. The planning board itself, what planning boards do, and we'll talk about variances. And I'm going to spend most of my time on public controls and zoning because I believe that is absolutely critical for you as brokers. The bundle of rights is, of course, your concept where when you own a property, you own it fee simple, you have the bundle, the many rights that you can potentially sell off or lease off for other people to use. You can make money you own a building. It's nice to make the money, but wouldn't you like to charge $300 a square foot for the ground floor for a tenant? Hey, that's not so bad. Unless, of course, the law says that the tenant doesn't have to pay rent, in which case you may decide to leave your property empty. And that, by the way, is happening to a lot of residential buildings today. And now, most importantly, we think about the need in zoning to plan for the future. It's absolutely critical to think about what is going to, where's the city going to be? As I said, imagine if I had to plan for 20 million people in 5 years. Think about the city of Warsaw has just gotten 250,000 or 500,000 new residents because of refugees. The cities of a lot of cities in Florida, people have 50% increase in property because they got refugees from New York and refugees from Haiti and refugees from Cuba and refugees from Mexico. Whether they're refugees or not is somewhat subject to interpretation, but what makes it work? Well, first of all, health. Health was incredibly bad. As I talked to you about in the M12 class, this city was deadly, as sadly every city was in the ages before sanitation. This is a typical tenement backyard in Lower Manhattan 150 years ago. Yes, those are your bathrooms, as they were called school closets. And unfortunately, as you can see with the snow and ice here, yes, that snow and ice, of course, was also right near where you were getting your water for your well, which meant all through the 19th century, vast amount of people were actually dying because of waterborne disease. So these had a monstrous impact on the health. Improving the water supply was probably the single most important thing for the survival and growth of New York City. Disease control, harmful industries, separating land use tries to separate harmful industries like polluting industries, from residentials. Much of zoning is about that concept of the residents and where the children are as the least harmful, and everything else has to be, kind of protect the children from those uses. We think about the water and most importantly, the sewer. Not really exciting stuff, but in fact, that HP, the water guys actually are the second highest budget in New York City. Well, of course, land use and safety. This isn't just police safety, but obviously fire safety. The city has burned many times. I was just reading that the original location of the New York Stock Exchange burnt down in, I think, the 1835 fire, which is pictured here. Yes, we had fires. Most people don't know about them, and mostly they were downtown, but vast sections of the commercial center of the city burnt down in 1776, 1835, and 1845. Today, of course, we think about a lot of factors: safety, crowd rampage. I mean, we just had a rampage at a concert the other night or an event the other night at the Barclays Center. So these are all parts of both the design and zoning. How can you design a place where it's safe? Obviously, you want to have it designed so it's physically safe for police, but also the roads work. They have ways for allowing, today they're thinking about land use in terms of how can we integrate bikes, ferries, not motorcycles, but lots of different non-car ways for people to get around. New York city planners are wishing we were Amsterdam. Whether that happens or not is another story. Although I must say, Amsterdam is one hell of a city if anybody gets a chance. There's a lot to be learned about a city where everybody rides bikes all the time and is polite to each other. And because they ride bikes, they're all very, very healthy. So that also cuts down on the costs of a city. Lots of things to think about. I would say the same thing, actually, when I was in Shanghai. I saw the opposite. In Shanghai, we all know what city bikes are. They put literally hundreds of thousands of city bikes on the street, as lots of individual capitalist companies put thousands of bikes out, and people didn't care. They just left them in the middle of the street. So the city of Shanghai literally picked up all of the hundreds of thousands of bikes and threw them away. They put them in a field, 20 acres of bikes stacked 3 meters tall. It was amazing. The point is that cities have to find a balance. And there's always that challenge. The various services they offer, ranging from, again, water and sewage to helping people get started as immigrants, for instance, as one type of service, or helping people live a dignified life as elderly. These are all factors that cities go into. Environmental concerns and zoning, of course, have a lot of the environmentalism has been in the belief that the world's going to end tomorrow. My personal opinion is a lot of that is crap, but I will tell you that it does have a really big impact on both the design of cities and how the history has evolved. New York City used to have an incredible amount of polluting industries. Well, we shipped them overseas. The burning rivers of the famous Cuyahoga River in Cleveland catching on fire wasn't that much different from the incredible pollution of Newtown Creek in between Queens and Brooklyn. The downside is whether that we're going to end the world with this or not, I'll leave that for you to decide. But the law says all new buildings have to be very attuned to pollution. We spend a lot of money, as I talked about in the construction class, we spend a lot of money remediating with older buildings, remediating the materials like asbestos and lead. They used to be the wonder materials, and now they're the wonder nightmares. But that said, we think about, in that classic thing, how do we separate those noxious uses from the uses that are positive, like, children, parks, etc. Well, one of the ways we make them really expensive. This is actually not a beautiful $7 billion piece of sculpture in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. This is actually the wastewater treatment plant at Newtown Creek. This is a titanium shelled eggs. And I do understand on Saturdays, you can actually sign up for a tour up here. $7 billion for a water treatment plant. Well, it is a beautiful piece of art, but It ain't cheap. So we think about these because, and why do we do that? Because of federal regulations that are required. Again, we want to think about the different drivers. We think also about the maintenance of values. After we've gone through environmental considerations, we need to make sure we can preserve value. This big skyscraper, man, that's going to make a lot of money. That's actually not what it looks like today. This was an early rendering of it. But ironically, it destroys a lot of value in a lot of the towers near it. That's an interesting catch-22. Well, in New York City, tough. If you build taller and block somebody else's view and you're allowed to build tall, zoning as of right, you can do what you want. Again, in this case, there was a building right behind this called City Spire, and it bragged that it had, the guy had a $100 million apartment, and he bragged that he had 360-degree views of New York City. And then a year later, he relisted the apartment for 100 million again, also not finding a buyer. And he says, well, it's got 350-degree views because the new tower was blocking, the Central Park Tower was blocking his view. And again, as we think about land value, when you create taller buildings, you create more taxes to collect. So you may hate that skyscraper, but that skyscraper may be paying for 500 firefighters or 300 social workers or 600 cops or, you know, a brand new office building for the city government. So those are things to think about. And that balance governments want to find, whether they are big governments or small governments, they need this primary driver of revenue, which is property taxes, as a way to fund the city. And in fact, these skyscrapers, not only do they create billions of dollars of income and therefore hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue for the city when they're being built. I know because I negotiated a lot of the labor deals for them with the cement league. But they also, once they get past their 421As, they will be creating a long-term revenue stream for the city. Of course, land use and aesthetic quality, it's great to build tall buildings, but what if it's just so hideous it doesn't work? Well, much of New York State has been zoned or has been easemented to say, no, either you can't build or you can't build tall. Obviously, the area around New Paltz would probably not be the best place for a 50-story skyscraper, but actually up in Syracuse, Syracuse is a dying city. And a developer up there proposed a 100-story tower in the middle of Syracuse. Ended up not happening, but it's a reminder that you have that balance between growth and aesthetics. Now, much of getting things done is, of course, also involved with politics. Not an official part of the list, but it's a reminder to you that you do have to pay attention to it. I'm not going to say whether you should be left or right or center or whatever, but I do think you should be engaged. The best brokers I know go to community board meetings. They pay attention to what's going on. And here's the secret. When you go to community board meetings and understand the writing and changing of this zoning, you find out about projects 3 years before they happen. And that is where the value is to happen. In New York City, the zoning was written originally in 1916. In 1961, they actually downzoned much of the city. They actually told you, well, I can build 50 stories now. Oops, as of 1961, you can only build 40 stories. In fact, there's a building on Park Avenue as we speak. I just took a great picture of it today, 425 Park. Because of the zoning, it actually, they had to rebuild it partway and keep some of the structure as a little trick in the zoning so that they could build 15 extra stories. So understanding the little tiny words, I know you're a real pro in New York City when you have the original zoning book, because that tells me, although it's 4,000 pages online, the guys who know it by paper are the guys who know their way around things. Of course, land use and politics. Again, we think about how the city's evolved. In this case, this is a chart by WNYC of households that are using housing vouchers. And that has become a huge impact on the city in the last couple of years. A lot of people are more and more getting rent stabilized or rent, market regulated housing. And that does have an impact on one of the challenges of brokers is that these are apartments you'll never sell. And so that the dwindling supply has an impact. Now, we think about planning for the future again. In 1945, they rolled out the suburbs of Nassau and Suffolk counties, and actually outer Queens looked like this in 1945 as 1946 as men came back from the war and women, and they settled down, got kids, and they moved out to the suburbs. Cheap gas, cheap roads, low taxes, and people moved out. Well, let's not forget, by the way, just a quick reminder, there was a lot of discrimination at this time. Places like Levittown, Levitt would not let people that weren't, whites or Jews to move into his community. So that racism existed, and unfairness, they made up 95% of the population at the time versus about 70% today. But this is actually not really fair. The racism is part of the zoning of today. A lot of these single family houses were zoned, and they try to keep it today because they don't want lower affordable build. They want it to be hard to live there, so people with less income can't come out and live to the suburbs. Now, there's no racist intent today, but the reflections of this have a big impact on the city. And again, I asked the question, New York City Planning Commission controls our zoning through the Department of City Planning and the Department of Buildings. And I love this question. What if we had to add 10 million people today? Well, there's no new land. There's no empty land in New York City other than swamps. And as of the federal regulations with wetlands, you can't build on them anymore. So how would we build? What do you think? Can we take this area out in Nassau County, tear down that one family house? This is about a 60 by 100 lot. Okay, guys, I built helped design a 43-story skyscraper on a 60 by 100 lot. On the same 1/7 of an acre, this actually is probably larger. This is probably a 1/4 acre. On 1/7 of an acre in Manhattan, because of the zoning, we built a 43-story building. And on that 1/7 of an acre, we netted at that time over $200 million. There are products right now that are netting over $1 billion per acre right now in not costs, but pure profit if they fully sell out. That's pretty amazing. Now, conversely, what would happen if the city shrank? The city was, in fact, shrinking prior to COVID. There was, and many would argue it still is, COVID caused a big evacuation, a lot of people moving back. So that also had an impact, a massive impact on stores. So the city had to rethink some of the zoning. Like one of the big parts of the zoning was sidewalk cafes. You weren't allowed to do anywhere. Sidewalk cafes were almost totally illegal in New York City, with only a few places that were allowed to do it. I actually think that's one great thing we learned from this unfortunate challenge. We said, you know something? Wow, sidewalk cafes, we could be like Paris. Well, we may not have a choice because obviously we've decreased a lot of population, and even worse, a lot of tourists aren't coming. So it does have an impact. Of course, in 1910, New York City was becoming the great economic center of the world, capturing all the investment capital of the North American continent. New York City was growing. They were building as high as they could build, given the technology they had. This is about 1910. I know that because the Singer Building and the Equitable Building aren't built yet. I do see a couple of other good ones I know. This building right here, actually, in 1910, talk about how the world was a different place. This is called the Customs House, and it's still there today. In 1910, the Customs House in New York generated 50% of the revenue of the United States of America. There was no income tax. So this was the most incredible center of wealth in the world because all these ships had to pay taxes before they could unload. So this was one of the powers of the port and of New York City. Of course, the skyscrapers were starting to build as fast as they could. I advised on this for 2 Rector Street, which is actually there today and a landmark. They were building, what was their limitation? Their limitation was steel and elevators. And they were quickly getting better and better about it. They were figuring out how to build taller. So eventually, come 1916, they had to say, look, we got to start putting some brakes on this. 90 West Street down here next to the World Trade Centers. This was a building that was amazing. This was is in fact the headquarters of Verizon, and it's a reminder that they had gotten to the point where buildings had gone from little tiny things like this just 30 years before to these monstrous things. And the city said, these things are getting so big, we can't even see the ground anymore. They cast a shadow so much we can't see anything. So the city, and more importantly, they were also looking at things like this is of course the elevated train line along Church Street, which later became the C train, and these various transportation methods, population density, health, airflow, air conditioning, all of these combine to help determine how buildings would be built. By pre-1916, they would build as tall as they could with this big air gap so you could survive in a non-air conditioned building. By 1916, they realized air conditioning is going to be coming and we can allow these towers. And this happens to be the zoning for the Empire State Building. As we continue, we look at, again, the 1916 zoning. It created the stepped pyramids that we know of today. My building just got a fresh outside new facade on it, but it is in its heart a 1931 setback building. As I look up Lexington Avenue, I see a whole bunch of them right now. And those setbacks actually are known today as the New York style of architecture. If you go around the world, if you see buildings with setbacks like this, they call it the New York style. And I know this because one of the architects I worked with was one of the primary designers when it wasn't so popular here in New York. Well, they were doing big glass boxes. He kept designing these beautiful things. And in fact, he became very famous overseas before getting really a lot more commissions here back in New York again. This is a 1920s building on, I want to say Fifth Avenue. I think it's the French building, but you can see the beauty and detail that went into it. Of course, 1925, they're coming up with really crazy plans. Like this was a plan to pave over the East River. Hey, go figure. Or how about, of course, by 1929, the city was growing, the boom before the bust, the city was growing vertically as fast as they could, filling in these walls of corridors of avenues like Park Avenue here. You can see the buildings were all built to approximately the same height, and then they had to set back. You can literally see that line. And you can imagine these buildings weren't long for this world, except that, well, that one's a church. They're not tearing that one down yet. Of course, 45 to 90, we talk about suburban growth. 1960, they had another plan. They were worried about nuclear evacuation. The 1950s, they started rolling out the interstate highway system. The interstate highway system was not for commerce. It was for the military. It was to move tanks around. Believe it or not, that was and is the initial purpose of the American highway system. In fact, this was a highway that was proposed that was going to go right through Manhattan. And many wish that it had been built because it's really hell to go across Manhattan. Just that mile from the Williamsburg Bridge to the Holland Tunnel was pretty difficult. So they proposed the 16-lane highway, but all the preservationists said, no way, we're going to keep our old ladies of the cast iron district of Soho. And they fought and stopped this highway from happening in Manhattan. But a reminder of today, and this is a cover from Life magazine in 1962. Life was a very, very big magazine at the time. Time Life was kind of the, shall we say, the mouthpiece of the New World Order, and they were very much celebrating the American way of life. And also they were realizing that maybe we had to be prepared for nuclear war. So that fear, who the hell would want to live in a bunker? I'm moving out to the city. Well, in 1961, we really see the exact repeat, exactly 50 years later, 60 years later, in 2020, where people moved out of the cities because of fear of their cities being risky to their lives. 61, they were worried about a nuke hitting their heads. Well, according to Russian state media yesterday, we should worry about that again today. But we'll leave that for another comment. Of course, that car-based society was planned by a guy named Robert Moses, one of the master planners. And he did a lot of that rethinking of cities to accommodate cars. In fact, the 1961 zoning really thought about that. In 1975, of course, the city was dying in a lot of areas. The Bronx was literally burning. And I say this, I was commissioner for the Bronx for a while for the building department. And I had a map of all the areas that burned during the 70s. I was replaying Game 6 of the 1977 World Series recently, and Howard Cosell said it. The Bronx is burning. Well, we've gone a very long way. In fact, the Bronx is probably one of the highest in return investments in the last 5 years. If you put your money in Tribeca 5 years ago, you lost money. If you put your money in the Bronx 5 years ago, you probably close to doubled your money. But of course, then the World Trade Centers were underway, different factors we think about. By 1985, New York City was really picking back up. There were a number of tax laws that at first helped and then crushed the real estate in 1986. This tower, when Trump Tower was built, the young punk, everybody did, some loved him, some hated him, but this guy really reversed the decline of central Manhattan by offering a new tower. And the mayor at the time worked really hand in fist with him, with Ed Koch, to try to encourage residential living. And not coincidentally today, this is the first major skyscraper on what is now Billionaires Row. Of course, 9/11 changed a lot. It goes without saying. A lot of people ask, would we ever build skyscrapers again? We don't care about city planning anymore. We have to plan for the city to end or for everybody to get hit by another terrorist attack. To be clear, that's space right here. That was where my office was. It was a nice day to be late for work, I got to tell you. But it's a little reminder that, the world can change and you'll have to adapt to it. We think about today, are we looking at exodus or rebirth? A lot of people have come back. I would say a lot of young people have come back. A lot of old people are not coming back. A lot of older people retired, closed their businesses and left. And so while we have 100% residential occupancy, we have 40% commercial occupancy. And the impact of that, nobody knows. Now, there were a lot of immigrants coming to New York City before. It slowed down for a while, but now with the several million people being brought across the Mexican border, they're literally flying up flights every night, and they're bringing them to neighborhoods in New York City, which are now overflowing with both Ukrainian and Latin and people from all over the world that are coming across the open border. And many of them are coming and repopulating New York City. Again, the green future, I'm missing some pictures here, but the big challenge, of course, how will New York City be all electric? As of this year, all new buildings are going to move forward. They're going to basically be electric. But most importantly, what will New York City real estate be like in office this world? Okay, as we go through 326, we want to think about private versus public land use controls. Private land use controls are when people get together and all agree that they will limit their use of their land and so that for the common good. And that takes the form of deed restrictions that, when you originally make the property, it's put in the deed that you're going to follow the homeowners association. Or if you're in a co-op, you're going to follow the co-op board and what the co-op board says. Or in a condo, you're going to follow the condo board and do what they say. Those are examples of private land use controls where you're controlled by the group that you agreed you would let them control you when you bought the property because it was in the deed and it was a condition of your purchase. You can't just move in and say, hey, I wasn't the first one here. I don't have to follow your rules. Well, yeah, you do. It's not that you have to follow the rules. It's your property has to follow the rules because deed restrictions are restrictions on the property. You can do what you want, but if the building and the lot and the property doesn't do what is required, they have the right to put a lien on your property and perhaps seize your property for non-compliance or unpaid taxes or unpaid condo fees, et cetera. Again, when you buy in, it's an agreement between the owners on the site. In this case, a corporation, that would be the homeowners association. Why would you let them control your life? Well, because if you keep your lawn mowed and you pay $200 towards that public pool every year, and you agree to not park in the street and only park in your driveway, the overall look of the community looks better. And if the community looks better and people maintain their properties, the property values go up. Make it clear. In 99% of people, their property is their single greatest asset. If you do anything that threatens the value of their property, they are coming after you, politically, personally, or any point in between. So deed restrictions and subdivision regulations are there because they want to protect values. In a city, in an urban environment, deed restrictions might be something like, hey, even on my lot, we own the lot, but you can't build anything that blocks the view. This is actually happening down in, and there's a lawsuit currently, down in the Two Bridges neighborhood, also known as Lower East Side or the Jewish Quarter or Chinatown, or this is the far area over between the Williamsburg and Manhattan bridges. Well, this neighborhood's evolved over the years, and a lot of people have co-ops here. And these old, many of these were union co-op buildings for union members. And in them, the co-op members wanted to make some money to maintain their building, so they are letting another building build on top. But they were fighting and saying, well, you're misinterpreting the deed restrictions. So they went to court to reinterpret it, and they try to stop the building, as you can see, of a building above it. Again, protect land values, prevent or punish irresponsible neighbors. I mean, would you want to have to go take a shotgun to your neighbor to make him behave? Hey, do me a favor, don't park your car in the street. And well, it'd be nice to have a mechanism other than a shotgun or a physical force. And of course, that is what deed restrictions are for. Again, they're not, an example might be no flags or no political signs. Political signs usually are allowed no matter what. Flags, sometimes they aren't. it's a kind of catchy subject. So very often people make their political statement into a flag, etc. But you agreed to that deed restriction when you bought it. So, if I can't fly my pirate flag out in front of my house during a Jimmy Buffett concert, whatever, then you can't do yours either. And again, the goal is everybody follows some rules that we all agree on as a private organization to put limits on our properties and hopefully add value. Now, with that subdivision regulation, if you don't respect it, they can put a lien on your property. Okay. And well, really, in many ways, the subdivision functions as a lien. And it may include it. Excuse me, a lien is the individual payment if you don't obey. Now, overall, that subdivision becomes essentially similar to an easement on a property, where it's a permanent running with the land limitation on the property. Now, it can be removed if everybody agrees to get rid of it, but that rarely happens. Again, that easement or HOA thing goes in as a deed restriction. When you buy the property, you have to comply with it, and again, they may set those subdivision regulations to do good things: keep uniformity of design, maintain proper valuations of properties. There's an example of a restrictive covenant. Again, it's a legal document between two or more parties. In this case, it's written into your deed. Again, it's community agreed upon standards. It's conditions for living in a place, but it also may be community design, maintenance, and landscaping. There's an example of a restrictive covenant I saw online. It was kind of funny. It said no contemporary design allowed. Now, they may have old colonial style buildings, and they didn't want a couple people having modern style buildings ruining the feel of the neighborhood. That's a typical thing. I think this was in Texas, but the concept is the same. Now, New York City, you don't have that as much because the city controls zoning as a public restriction. And in this case, they wanted to restrict 3,000 square foot minimum properties. Why? Because they wanted to make sure that nobody has a bad comp. That I don't want to be parked next to 1,000 square foot building because it'll make my property less valuable. Again, covenants run with the land. But as a community, they have to enforce it. If they don't, then the doctrine of laches kicks in, and they will lose that right to enforce. Again, private deed restriction examples might be no secondary apartments. That zoning often does that as well, although that may change on a state basis soon. They're looking at allowing accessory apartments on a statewide basis. So keep an eye out for that. That's going to change a lot. Architectural design, exterior palettes. Imagine I lived in a neighborhood in Maryland that everybody had very natural color paints. And this one lady paints her house bright blue. And that bright blue house didn't quite look like the rest of the community. But the community, well, they walked by and sneered and said, "Oh, that looks gross." But that didn't matter until the homeowners association took her to court and said, "Ma'am, that's not a color that's allowed. You've got to repaint your house." And she fought it and fought it and fought it and lost. And then she said, drop dead. She moved, and then the new owner had to paint the house. Again, pet restrictions. A lot of buildings, for instance, will only allow 25 or 30-pound dogs. There's a very, very famous article in the New York Times years ago where the New York Times reporter is walking around Central Park, and he sees a very nervous dog owner. And the dog owner is kind of pushing around this big dachshund that needed a little more running, shall we say. And this owner, like me, so the dog's running around, and in fact, the dog weighed 31 pounds. And the reporter asks him, "Sir, what are you doing? Why are you so worried? And why are you pushing this dog so hard?" And he says, "I've got to weigh in today. My dog's got to be under 30 pounds by 6 o'clock tonight, or I've got to get rid of him. The co-op only allows 30-pound dogs." Well, sounds crazy, but that can happen. Tree removal, fence type, number of vehicles, and few obstructions. Now, these are private restrictions that may also appear as public. Doctrine of laches is a legal example of how these uses, that the community has to enforce it. Now, if you have private agreements between parties and you have a deed restriction, the organization like the HOA or the condo board has to get a court order to make you to comply if you won't comply. And when they do so, they have to pursue everybody equally. Example, the old lady who had lots of Easter stuff out in her house. Well, communities might say you can only have Easter stuff till May 15th. So this person keeps her stuff out, but her husband dies, so she keeps it up, and it makes her sad. She doesn't want to take it down. And it's, July, and they said, she lost her husband. So, well, we'll let her keep it up for a couple more months. And next year it's still up and it's falling apart. It's looking raggy. And the guy down the street says, hey, I'm going to put my Eid al-Fitr decorations out. I'm Islamic, so I want to celebrate my holy day. And in fact, the Indian guy down the street has the Festival of Colors, which is called Holi, and he puts his stuff out in his house, and they both leave him out too long. Well, the community has to prosecute all equally to make sure they clean up the areas, because if they don't enforce the law equally, then it doesn't enforce it all. So if they don't make the lady with the Easter stuff get rid of her stuff, then they won't have any standing to make the other people get rid of their stuff. Latches is an unreasonable delay in pursuing a right of claim. So I told you to clean up your site. You didn't do it. I waited 6 months, and that was cute. Now get rid of it. Well, I put you on notice. But if you didn't put me on notice for 2 years, well, I can leave it up. So that's the opposing party renders the granting of a claim inequitable, which means you didn't enforce it against me. I can do whatever I want. This is actually very similar to trademark law, where if the music company, for instance, doesn't go out and say, hey, you played my music without paying me royalties. If they don't enforce the trademark, then the music company will actually lose their trademark to the music. It's very similar to that doctrine of laches. Okay, public land use control. Now, we've gone through some of the aspects of when you privately decide to agree with a group and to conform with the laws, and you do that because, hey, you want to make some money. But this is when you move into a community, a town or a village or a city, and when you buy land, you're now required to comply to their rules. Again, it's the public land use controls, the government responsibility to protect public welfare. Now, that's a big, broad statement, isn't it? We've seen a lot of, the last couple of years, we've seen the government do a lot of things, like lock us in our houses and do whatever thing, because they felt that would protect the public welfare. Well, how it evolves in the future, we'll see, but that was an example of police power in the medical field. We actually, when I was a commissioner of the building department, I did things like order buildings demolished. In 2007, we almost had a major Ebola outbreak. We were looking at closing the bridges to Manhattan. Again, why do you have public land use controls? Maybe to control growth. Maybe you don't want growth to go too fast, or you don't want, maybe you only want new factories, but you don't want new apartments. Excuse me. Of course, like for instance, the last couple of years, Greenpoint has had a major push to have a lot of movie studios. With the demise of Netflix and some of the streaming services, we don't know how that's going to play out soon, but we do know that the city did a lot to try to encourage new movie studios because they were new jobs. The 50,000 factory workers that used to be in Greenpoint and Williamsburg are all gone. Luckily, most cities would love to have a whole bunch of millionaires from all over the country, all over the world, moving into Williamsburg, like what happened. Most people aren't usually that fortunate that they'll backfill a dying neighborhood with lots of wealthy people. Again, government is there to control growth, create community limits, protect values. That's kind of an open statement, and meet the goals, such as I want them to build buildings because then they'll pay more taxes, which will generate more revenue, which will supply more fire trucks and police officers and better sewers. And those are the goals that a city might have. Now, and as an example, one of the things we think about is the state has a number of controls. In particular, we look at things like the State Environmental Quality Review. Again, this is where the government, in many cases, the state government has control over the land to prevent pollution. Okay, it's usually regulated by the New York State DEC, but you can still build if you follow the guidelines. This is an example of a very polluted area of New York City called, it's a railway yard. You can't get much more polluted than that. Well, the railway yards of Hudson Yards have since been covered and are now, of course, a very fascinating park. And we see that today. The state environmental quality review, of course, is out there, and its job is to, make sure when you do build that you're not building on unmitigated, unremediated land that's still really filthy. In fact, 50 years ago, the New York City waterfront, particularly this area, the Brooklyn waterfront, was filthy, polluted, trashed, all kinds of nasty chemicals. And today they've stabilized the chemicals, cleaned it up, and now it's a lot of residential buildings. Now, as we think about the environmental impacts, when you do deal with polluted sites, you have to get, or even when it's not polluted, when you want to do a big project, you have to ask, or the community can ask for a environmental impact statement. And very often this is a way of delaying projects. You can't build there because it's, ducks land there in the summertime. And that all goes into reports, and it takes a lot of time and money. When you ask them, it's a way of slowing down development. Many would argue that this is probably one of the biggest reasons why new construction is almost at a standstill in California, because they really have some very powerful laws to protect their environment, and given their drought and stuff, that's not an entirely bad thing. In New York City, we see the same thing, where we, have a number of environmental factors like huge wetland areas. People built in the 1920s, and when Sandy came, a lot of those areas were flooded on places like Staten Island and the Bronx. Flood zones, big deal, but also, again, appearance, historic factors, and subdivisions. All of these are things that go into the environmental impact of a building. Is that new community or building or subdivision going to be, is going to not stress the community's infrastructure out? Environmental impact statements is an example of a couple of big projects in that Two Bridges area, the Dumba, or what used to be called the Jewish Quarter, or the Communist Quarter. There are a lot of different names for it over the years. I'm advising on a building called the Jewish Socialist Building down on Henry Street, and the Jewish Forward was the name of a very famous newspaper down there, and it was Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, particular in the early 20th century, had been treated badly and left their countries, and they wanted to set up communism, which is funny because 50 years later, most of the Taiwanese, the Chinese that came to Chinatown or were already there were very supportive of the anti-communists. So we see this interesting dilemma of historical evolution. But we also see these environmental impact statements as a way of potentially slowing growth. Now, they could say the ground is polluted, they'll be right. But what it's really about, of course, is these new buildings, they're going to completely wipe out the views of these people. So very often the real reason for not wanting a property to develop is not what you think. This one's already been built. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty cool looking. This is from Extel. Gary Burnett built this because this was when he was a young kid. He grew up in the Jewish Quarter down here on Cherry Street, and he kind of wanted to go back to his roots and build a really big building. Of course, wetlands and other environmental impact, as I said, flooding areas are now federally regulated. Tidal, river, and wet watershed areas can all have limitations. And, oh, by the way, Sandy's not the first time it's happened. There's a Staten Island advance from, I think, the 1980s, and a reminder of a big rainstorm causes a big problem. Now, it was only a couple of months ago that we had some incredible rainstorms in September of 2021, 8 months ago, where we had a dozen people killed in rainstorms, and the city was completely paralyzed. I have an image from that night at 11:30 that night. Every subway line in New York City was closed down except the 7 train. We think again about the government, the public control of property, and that's regulated by police power. The police power of the physical police, eminent domain, taxation, and escheat. These are powers of the government to seize your rights as a fee simple landowner. So again, eminent domain, well, let's go through these. One mention is the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act from 320 on page 329. This is a case where the developers had to give what they were promised, and the law essentially, and of course, it's a federal law. The federal law came about roughly at the time where people were buying buildings from the back of a magazine. Before the internet, there were these little classified ads in the back of a comic book or a magazine. Well, if you told them you would buy a house on a smartphone. They'd say what, from 50 years ago, they'd say, hey, what's a smartphone and why are you taking this cavalierly? And they'd be buying houses from on an ad in the back of Popular Mechanics or a comic book. Well, a lot of these lots, they would build stuff. And again, the federal government is to make sure that marketing schemes, there's a famous saying in real estate, I'm going to sell you swampland in Florida. And that was because they were buying from the back of a magazine instead of an internet ad. There have always been scams. And you would find out, you thought you bought a great lot, you'd pay them $10 a month for 10 years, and you move down to Florida and find out there was no house and there's just a swampland. Now, with the Interstate Land Sales Act, they have to deliver the properties in time. If they delay and they can't deliver in time, the sale can fall through. This happened to some brokers in 2009 where the buildings were delayed. Often, ironically, the complaints were put in by people who had promised to buy the building, but the building had gone down in value. You promised to buy this apartment for $1 million. And then, believe it or not, in between 2005 and 2008, property values in Miami dropped. You guys aren't going to believe this, 90%. Property values absolutely collapsed down there. And with that, people were doing anything they could to get out of contracts. So an innovative lawyer, Adam Lightly Bailey, it's not a commercial, but he came up with this idea that we could use this federal thing to say, you didn't give me the apartment on time and you didn't give me the size that he promised. And this lawsuit scared that unbelievably scared the developers. It was called the Yellowstone suit. And the argument was that you promised me 1,200 square feet, but it's really maybe 1,000 square feet because you count the outer walls and stuff. So actually, by the way people measure it, the building wasn't as good. I know one great thing right now coming up is a guy is suing because he bought a $20 million condo in a very tall building on 57th Street. And yet there is a column coming down right in the middle of his bedroom. And it's not a very big bedroom, although it's very high up. He's very mad and suing to get out of the deal. So these are federal government controls that allow you, or state government controls that allow you to get out of deals. Article 9A, of course, this is a New York State regulation, and it talks about the sale of empty lots, vacant or subdivided lots. Again, people would take a farm, cut it up into 100 lots, like this subdivision plot right here. When you buy these, the seller, whether it be a new condominium or a new subdivision like this, the plan has to be approved by the Attorney General's office. And I'm kind of funny at that because the Attorney General used to be in my office all the time when she was a council member in Brooklyn. Public, again, federal loans as an indirect driver. Of course, one of the most powerful forms of controls on housing is the ability to borrow money. Not the HUD one, but the housing forms out there. Federal government, because it finances buildings, it has a big impact. We'll talk about that more in another section. In the mortgage section, we'll cover that. Of course, taxation itself, we'll cover in M15, but taxation is a form of taking. When you buy a property, yes, you own it. But if you don't pay your property taxes, we all know you get to protest them, but once you've been told what you got to pay it. And that becomes a lien on your property. So if you don't buy it, does you get a lien? So, and also they can tell you how you can use your land. You might be able to build a skyscraper on your lot one day, and the next day you can only build a one family. You can imagine that would pretty badly hurt the value of the building. Another key element, of course, is the building codes. New York State has fire protection codes. New York City, and any town or city in New York State is allowed to adopt more stringent building codes. New York City is actually, of course, has its own building codes, and New York City actually had them before New York State did. But New York City's all building codes are not, you do not design to keep a building up forever. It can't. You cannot design it for earthquakes, hurricanes, fires, etc. This building is a beautiful thing. Right, it burnt down. No, this building is, yes, it caught on fire. Yes, it badly burned, but it looks like it stayed up long enough that everybody probably got out. And as importantly, while it did burn, it was made of inexpensive materials, so people could afford it. It did burn. It damaged the adjacent property, but did not spread and destroy it. So zoning and building codes are out there to try to control, as a government control. They tell you how you build your building. And that government control is an example. Now, the building permits process itself is a form of control for two reasons. One, they want to make sure you're building as per the code and zoning, but also when you pull a permit, the basis of your building goes up, therefore they can charge you more taxes. Your property, your assessment goes up. Again, fees, inspections, and delays are all part of that building's permit process. And this is very important. A lot of the times as a broker, you'll be advising people about, hi, you can build this, but maybe it might be good to, add 2,000 square feet on in the back. I advised the property once. This lady paid a lot of money for a property down in Greenwich Village. She spent about $8 million, or about $3,000 a square foot. This lady from Japan, she was very quiet. She was really, really smart. And she did her research. And even though it wasn't her native country, she said, I'm going to do well here. So her property was $3,000 a square foot, but it had a big backyard. She could build in the back. Building in the back only cost $500 a square foot. But once it was built, that $500 a square foot extension was worth $3,000 a square foot. So she made millions of dollars by making her house bigger. So that's an example of the permits process affecting both the tax as well as making sure the building is built well. Many communities take a long time to approve, and environmental rules, inspections, all these things can have an impact. I'm advising on a project right now. I told them they've got to wait at least 5 years just to get the environmental impacts done because the property is so polluted. Now, with properties and buildings in New York City or anywhere in the state, you will have what's called a certificate of occupancy. On page 331 is a typical blank C of O from the city of Rochester. This is an example of C of O for New York City. Again, down below, a 5-family house, 1 family plus 2 plus 2, a cellar and 2 floors. A cellar actually doesn't count as a story, by the way. A basement or above grade is a story. Below grade is a cellar. Again, the 2nd to 10th floors, you can see showrooms and factories. In this case, this old C of O actually was segregating between male and female. Well, because it was a factory, it allowed less males. Really, it's a function of their bathroom size, but it was also a function of they wanted to know how many people were on each floor so that the stairs could be designed for an emergency evacuation, and ventilation and all those things could be done. In this case, men and women were separated because this was a garment factory and most of the workers were women. Moving on, if you don't have a certificate of occupancy, you might want to get a letter of no objection. This is where you present the old, if your building was built before 1916, you can ask for a C of O, or you may not have a C of O. And with that, the DOB may offer, the Department of Buildings in New York City might offer you a LNO, or letter of no objection. This says, okay, we've studied your records, and okay, you're a 1 family. Well, in this case, 1880s, this was built probably as 1 family, but the owner of the house said, no, I'm a 2 family, and I've got a job in Manhattan for a while, so I'm going to rent my place out. Well, de Blasio decided, it was Mayor de Blasio himself said, I've got a 2 family, and he was rejected. I won't tell you the address. It would look something like this. This isn't his particularly. This is my old buddy Werner, who's since retired. But the owner was looking for some certain requirements. And the department said, okay, you don't have a C of O, but we'll let you use this. And this letter effectively becomes the C of O for the property. Eminent domain, this is a federal taking of land. Eminent domain is a police power where the government says, I got to take your land for some purpose. As I said, 1950s, they did for the nuclear city. And I mean nuclear not as in central, I mean nuclear as in, oh my goodness, Manhattan is going to get hit by a nuclear bomb, so we got to get out by highways. And that was the way they thought back then. You can kind of understand the fear, the polio, the nuclear weapons, all the crazy things people were so scared about. And they still are today, but we've just learned to live with them. I don't hear too many people screaming and running down the street saying the Russians are going to nuke us, or the Ukrainians, or whoever is going to, I don't know, pick a person that wants to nuke us. 20 countries have nukes these days. Of course, 1940s, they used eminent domain for slum clearing, for making subways, highways, and very often it creates fertile land in the sense that new development can be built. As I said earlier, the Schwab house was torn down and a single family house was torn down, and they built 500 apartments in its place. So that's an example of demolishing slums, but also palaces. Robert Moses again versus Jane Jacobs, who was a preservationist. She wanted to stop and successfully stop this highway. Of course, eminent domain today in modern times has a real need to try to keep cities alive. Is it in many cases they will maybe demolish a building, a community to say we got to make more revenue for the city. Oh, that's a public good, so we can demolish your house. And the person's like, no, it's my house. Drop dead. Well, like sometimes you go to court, and in 2005, I think, there was a great important case called the Kelo case. Well, Kelo is not an acronym. It's actually, I believe, a name of a lady. Miss Kelo had a pink house down in this area of New London, Connecticut. Now, New London, Connecticut was you'll hear this common recurring theme. New London, Connecticut was one of the wealthiest cities in the United States and one of the wealthiest cities in the world in the 1820s and 1830s. They made their money selling tobacco, opium, slaves, whales, and whatever else they could trade, and wheat and every good farm crops as well. It's a brutal reality. Obviously, a lot of those are not so politically correct these days, but it's a reminder that the world economy was a different place back then. Well, fast forward 200 years, and New London really doesn't need to exist, other than a big naval base, which is very, very important. One of the heads of our Navy's submarine bases. But most of the economy of the rest of the city has kind of died. People moved up to big houses up in the hills rather than being close to the fort, where in the 18th century, you'd be worried about a British raid or a French raid or an Indian raid, so you might want to live near the fort. Things change. Again, the city was, this lady said, no, you can't have my house. New London said, yes, we can. We're going to give it to a development company so they can build something. First, it was going to be Pfizer. Then it was going to become a mall. I forget all the nuances of it, but the land was assembled to give it to the cities. The city was, they said we're allowed to take it, and we understand your rights, but the economy is very important. We've got to revive the economy of New London. Well, she lost. There was a compromise, though. I actually visited the house last year. Unfortunately, I was up at a funeral in New London, and I stopped by, and here's the Kelo house. It even says the Kelo house outside, a little plaque. And again, there was a movie a couple of years ago in 2019 about this, and it was the pink house that she wouldn't let them tear it down. The Supreme Court, they went all the way to the Supreme Court. Kelo versus the United States of America, Kelo lost. But the city said, okay, we'll pick your house up and we'll move it, but we can't keep the land. Again, urban renewal areas, very often they tore down areas for decades. They stayed empty. And then, finally in Essex Crossing was revived about 5 years ago, and they've built an amazing set of buildings on what had previously been empty land. The payment, though, was the community, which had originally wanted 100% inclusionary housing. They wanted to build a housing complex. Inclusionary means that the government's going to pay a large chunk of your rent. And the city said, oh, we can't do that. But finally, they cut a deal. The apartment buildings would do 50% inclusionary housing and 50% market rate. So the developer said, hey, I think we can make money at this. Let's build. And today, if you haven't been there, there's some really cool buildings down there. I was just down there this weekend. Again, eminent domain, same problem. Atlantic Yards in Brooklyn was a big, nasty train yard, a bunch of crappy buildings, not so very valuable. The city said, hey, we got like 10 train stations coming here. We got heavy rail, all this stuff. Let's tear down the buildings, declare eminent domain. The state actually, rather than the city, confiscated the land, paid them fair market rate, and they promised 15 new apartment buildings, but I believe only about 5 have been built. A Chinese developer got control of the land and then pretty much kind of isn't doing so good financially. So a lot of the development is stopped. The deal was, you build the stadium and promise to build these 15 buildings later. Of course, he built the Barclays Center, a good use of eminent domain, but he kind of forgot about building the rest of the stuff. Another type of zoning challenge in New York State, this sounds crazy, but it's very real. The Indian tribes actually have, in some opinions, they own most of the state of New York. These Indian tribes made deals with, the state of New Amsterdam, the colony of New York, and the British West India Company, And they made a deal saying, look, we'll take your land, we'll rent your land from you until the sun doesn't shine, which kind of means forever, right? But in theory, the Indians may be able to claim that land back. So this is a potential cloud on the title of almost all the properties in upstate New York. And don't think this doesn't happen. In fact, last year, 2 years ago, actually, 40% of the entire state of Oklahoma was given back to some Indian tribes. You can imagine what kind of a mess that is. Oh, I've been on this land for 100 years. Well, yeah, but yes, it's an entire city of Tulsa as an example, but that entire city is on Indian land, and the Indians now own it again. So you got to pay taxes to the Indians now. Wow, that's pretty cool. Again, another important police power is escheat. This is when you pass away without land or heirs, the government gets your money. The government has to check for people, but if they don't find anything, the government gets it. Okay, now we think about zoning. Now, zoning is the most important thing for land use value in New York City. And this is a map of New York City in Chelsea. This is pretty much 24th Street in Chelsea. This is 23rd and 9th in around 1879. You can see the horse streetcar companies and the factories right next to the residences, just on top of each other. Would anybody want to live in a house right here, right next to a piano factory and a combination rubber factory? Okay, this would sound nice, but it's still, think about all the smells and chemicals. You got a house right next to a gas fixture plant. That's not really good. So this really terrible mess of heavy industry growing fast, residences living among them, it really was causing a problem. So they said, we got to separate, we got to rezone New York to separate those uses. In the 19th century, they said this. In the 20th century. Now, the 21st century, they're actually going backwards. And they're saying, well, back then we want to separate, but today, areas like Soho, people want to live where people are in factories, and many of the old factories, of course, are now lofts, but it's okay and cool to live right above a Bloomingdale's or something. So a lot of the zoning encourages that. Of course, local authority, as I said, the local government gets to decide. The New York City government got to decide that the West Farms project could be built. The community, the developers said, we'll give you 1,000 apartments for housing, and we'll get to keep 2,000 for ourselves. And the city will actually also let us build our buildings taller. And you can see this on the expressways today. Also, another part of local authority would be a type of a co-op, which is a private community, such as Forest Hills. There are a number of private communities around the city, whether they be Pomander Walk on the Upper West Side or the Forest Hills or Kew Gardens, that have kind of their own rules, but they still have to follow state rules. They even have private streets, so they're responsible for plowing their streets. And with those zoning rules, of course, do we want to be New York City with a 4,000-page zoning, or Houston with no zoning at all? Their only limitation is, are you following the federal rules for things like floodplains, and do you have water supplies? That's things they care about. Now, New York City zoning, of course, the multiple articles here, as I said, it's over 3,000 pages, almost 4,000, and then many, many references. And these are the things that determine how you will build in New York City. Again, the original 1916 one was only 16 pages. Today, it's 3,600. As you can see here, this is, if any of you live in Bushwick, this is an example of a study map where they would be coming up with some design. A lot of trains, but a lot of old and obsolete buildings. So the argument was, instead of having single family houses right next to the trains, why don't we change the zoning to encourage 10 and 20-story apartment buildings? Then a local politician in the community said, no, we think this may sound good to you, but to us, it sounds like it means our rent is going to go up. And they actually blocked this rezoning. Again, quick reviews of land use around the city. We think about Manhattan. Red, commercial. Purple is actually, the purple is in manufacturing. Now, much of this manufacturing zone is from the past. These areas for manufacturing used to be the industries, and most of those industries have left. So the city actually has to keep some of them, but many of these commercial zones are long since passed. Again, conversely, residential areas often have expanded into old industrial areas, and first they were illegal, and then they eventually legalized them through things like the state loft law or city rezonings like we saw in Soho. Again, the Bronx, when the Bronx was created, it was a little bit of paradise, huge amount of parkland. In 1900 to 1920s, the major, the elevated trains, the subways were a powerful network to encourage growth. I'm looking at a house right now It was built in 1899 in the Oldenville section of the Bronx. And, 10 years, 20 years later, I mean, that was a far suburb of New York. Yet 20 years later, when they built elevated tracks, the area became very valuable. Of course, the Bronx has gone through a lot of different neighborhoods and rezonings. You have the very expensive Fieldston area, or the very industrial and very economically valuable South Bronx area. This is tons of rail lines. Mass transit is what drives the values here in the Bronx. Subways, trains, etc. Also, all the old industrial stuff is now gone. Now is replaced by 20-story buildings. This project, again, in Brooklyn, we can see same things. We see the industrial uses on the waterfronts, and then the residential use. Tan is more of a higher density residential use. Of course, in Brooklyn, you look at areas of revival like Dumbo. In the 1980s, it was a total dump. This developer, Dave Lennis, bought up the area. He bought buildings for $10 a square foot. It was nasty and gross, and nobody wanted to be there. Nobody wanted to pay rent. Well, he had these buildings. Luckily, the taxes were low. So he wanted to create something. So he said, I'm going to use artists. They're going to be my weapon. Well, first is theater. Then they say, we need some security down here. Now, this guy was a quick thinker. What does he do? Does he, hire a security company and charge everybody as a community? He could have done that. But instead, he got smart. He said, how do I do security? Well, he gave Gleason's Gym a really good lease. And surprise, surprise, 24 hours a day, boxers are walking around the neighborhood. And, chances are that, people that try to improve themselves are people who are probably going to help others. In fact, security happened, arts happened, and now, of course, Dumbo is one of the wealthiest areas, one of the most expensive, and I'd say wealthiest places in Brooklyn, if not New York City. Again, zoning has patterns. This is an example of the East New York commercial corridors with these hatched areas, the industrial corridors along Atlantic Avenue where the trains are. Railway used to determine economic value. Today, not so much. Now it's truck routes. And said, maybe we don't want industry here anymore. How about if we encourage, instead of, factories that are all dying, let's go ahead and try to convince them to build houses. And I got one lot. It's a really successful building. So they took it out of the zoning. So now I'm going back to the city planning. I'm going to ask them to go put it back in the zoning. And if I'm able to get it changed, this guy will go from commercial or residential, from manufacturing to residential use. And I believe if I'm able to do it, I'll create about $50 million in value for it. Other inside the zoning or other types of hidden in the zoning resolution, it just describes a line creating a very specific geometry on a bunch of streets in Brooklyn. And within this line, you can apply to get an exemption to build a much bigger house. We call this the oh gosh, I forget the politician's name, Dov Hikian rule, I believe. And that's because this neighborhood is called Borough Park, and it has evolved to be a pretty heavily Orthodox Jewish neighborhood where people are required by their faith to have a lot of children. Now, whether you're Jewish or any religion, the law has changed. So whatever religion you are, you could make your case with the BSA, the Board of Standards and Appeals, and they would let you build a larger house. Queens, we see industrial and commercial areas. We see, the little city that's been created out of Flushing. Most people don't know that Flushing actually was started in the 1630s. Flushing is one of the oldest settlements in the United States. But today, it's some of the newest residents in the United States. So again, we think their career just focusing on a 100-block area. Of course, Long Island City has just gotten insane. I'm working on some products out there this weekend. This is only a 10th of all the new towers out there today, one of which is almost 1,000 feet tall. This is an area that 30 years ago was 10 feet tall. It was all, 1 and 2 and 3-story factories. What I love about this is, in fact, Long Island City is the great growth of a city across the river, but very close to, by subway, the main center of the city, which is, many would say, Grand Central. So it's so close to Grand Central, right? And years ago, I had a class come in from a very, very intelligent university in China. There is an MBA class, and we were talking about, I gave them some tours around areas of the city where there was growth. And I was very interested because we had one more day, we were going to try to get it. And I said, where do you want to see? Where do you want to see something about New York that's great for real estate development? And I thought they'd say, oh, let's go to the Empire State Building. Let's go to the World Trade Center site. Instead, they said, I want to go to Williamsburg and the Brooklyn waterfront, because their university is based in Shanghai called Jiao Tong University. And they had seen the right bank of the Huangpu River in Beijing, in Shanghai, was the old part of town. The across the nasty swampy area called Pudong. Well, now that's the center of town. That's evolved. 50 years later, that the center of the city has moved over the river to the new area. So these investors were looking to go to the new area, not the old areas. And I gave them a lot of credit for that. Again, we think about immigration, the rezonings just in Queens, and there's a lot more past this. But you can see where they literally, on a tactical block level, they will change the zoning and fundamentally cause billions of, in this case, manufacturing and residential get to live next to each other. And this has created a lot of new growth. Staten Island, of course, industrial, the commercial flooding of Sandy, a lot of work to try to be more environmentally absorbent and conscious. As a major manufacturer, we thought about the waterfront of Brooklyn, and of course the Manhattan waterfront, where these old, obsolete, useless buildings like 111 8th Avenue, before when New York City was a major industrial place, they would bring trains in by the either by ferries across the Hudson. Trains would literally come into this building. This building is so strong. The floors are 18 inches thick. It's so strong that you can literally park train cars inside of it. Well, nobody really uses train cars anymore. So for years, it was kind of not very well used. They were used for storage. In the 1990s, I was with a large investment bank, and we were, the company who owned it, because the building is such a fortress, they were turning it into a data center. But surprise, surprise, decides to buy it. And yes, this is Google's main building in New York. And so again, we think about that. Okay, very quickly, second code, everybody, M10Y. Okay, M10Y, it's your second code. Please put your name again in the chat room. And I am going to take a 10-minute break. Hope everybody's gotten a kick out of what we covered so far. We've covered through a lot of the stuff in the books. We've gone up to approximately page whatever. But we thought about how the local government control makes things work. So as we go through, and Alicia has arrived just in time, so that we are going to now take a 10-minute break. And then I'm going to go through a little bit of bonus stuff, not too much. It's not covered much in the book, but I want you to see how New York City zoning works.
Sorry,
Hi, Paula.
Hi, sorry. Can you repeat the code again? Is it M10Y?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
That's good. There'll be one more code at the end of the class. Okay, everybody, I'm going to check out for 10 minutes and rest my voice, get a drink, and we'll everybody get your questions ready for when we come back. And most importantly, I hope you're enjoying it. So on that note, see you later for 10 minutes. If I can find my way into my screen. Okay, everybody, let's lock and load. How's everybody doing again? And we've talked about, of course, public control of your land. Yes, you own fee simple, but the government tells you what you can do with your land in many communities, in most communities in New York State. Again, why do they tell you what you can do with your land? Because they want to make sure that the more hazardous things are managed. Use group, as you can see in New York City, there's 18 use groups, and each use on a property is scored. One use group 1, which is a single family detached house, all the way up to use group 18, which is maybe a lead smelter. As you might imagine, I probably wouldn't care if I had a one family house next to me, although as long as they're not loud and obnoxious. However, having a lead smelter next to me or an oil refinery, maybe that's not so sexy. And in fact, they used to have them right in the middle of the communities. Well, things have changed. So anyway, on that note, I just want to, before I continue going on to the next slide, does anybody have any questions for the first 2 hours that we've covered tonight? Anybody got any questions or thoughts? It's your chance to sound smart to the rest of your audience. As a reminder, by the way, you can ask questions at any time. I may have to slow down a little bit and catch up with your question, but you're welcome to take off anytime. Anybody got questions from the first half as we reviewed the reasons why governments control, and we looked at private land use controls and public land use controls. Now we're continuing through public land use controls with that zoning. Use group 1, single family to 18. Let's see what's out there. Why do we control it? As I said, proper adjacency was what was found in the 19th century to be so critical. Because again, having a lead smelter next to your house wasn't so sexy. But the funny part is, 100 years later, we don't have the same type of manufacturing. So we've actually seen that reverse. I have a couple of 3D printers at my apartment. So in theory, I am an industrial use, a manufacturing center in a residential use. That would be illegal. But hey, they don't care that much anymore. So in New York City, we look at the zoning use groups. For all of you fancy people, that's Appendix A in the zoning and or Articles 32, 22, 32, and 42 of the zoning. The goal is that separation of dangerous uses. And again, it sounds crazy, but it was all about the idea of all these little kids running in the street. Well, nobody has kids anymore, so that's kind of not as big of a deal. Not many anyway. We think about that balancing of resources. The zoning used to be based upon, for instance, the providing of services like schools. If your area, conversely, they want to control growth to determine things like sewage. Out in areas like the Hamptons, they are on sandy soil and they have very limited capacity to manage wastewater. So they actually will tax you and regulate you based upon the number of bedrooms you have as a way of minimizing the amount of flushes. Minimizing flushes equals minimizing the load on the water treatment plants. Sounds crazy, but this is the way zoning and land use can work. Now, this is the New York City chart of land uses. This is the holy grail. It thinks about across the top, we go from 1 to 18. The residential use being the least interfering, which you can do everywhere except some of the heavy industry places. They don't want you having a house in a manufacturing zone. Now, that said, sometimes there are people, our grandfather, the house was built 1 house on the Queens Brooklyn border, the Onderdonk house was built in the 17th century. But today, that area is a manufacturing zone. If you've ever been to the end of Steinway Street, you'll see the Steinway house. It's sitting surrounded by industrial uses. So residential all the way to 18, and the residential, community facility, retail, general service, and manufacturing are the categories. Now, in the zoning map, you'll see the districts, the R1 to R10. Usually the higher the number, it's the higher the density. And R1 is single family, and R10 is a residential skyscraper. Commercial C1 to C8. These are, again, the C1 to C8 are the districts for commercial. The larger the number, different types. It's actually, the tallest isn't the best. 7 and 8 are specialty uses. If you're joining late, just put the time you joined in, and we'll get you credit for the hours you're here. Again, we talk the C1 to C8 and then the manufacturing districts. Again, manufacturing can be the most polluting, so they don't want residential in them, or they don't want, well, basically no residential, but for the most part, you can do everything else. One little box was very important, used to be very important, was this box right here, which was in M1 districts, they allowed use group 5, which is hotels. That tiny little box was the holy grail, and this caused the building of 100 hotels in New York City. Just that little gray box caused billions of dollars in construction. Now, the city and the hotel unions have since decided that can't be done anymore. So they have changed it where, yes, you can build it, but you need a special permit, which means often it means you have to agree to hire union workers. And that's an example where politics and political patronage interfere or intersects zoning. And many believe it's for the public good. Again, safety, zoning really was about, obviously high density of housing. The small houses on the outer fringes of the city, maybe they're not the best houses based upon the building structure, such as wood frame buildings are not allowed to be anything more than 2 family. Okay, use group 1, here we go. Single family detached buildings. My favorite, of course, being Ditmas Park accessory. This is a common term where people, they like to say they have an accessory apartment. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as an in-law apartment in New York City. Now, I say this because state law, state use of houses is called the MDL, the multiple dwelling law. This law is about may change. And in particular, I want to remind you that if you have an illegal apartment in a building, you are operating an illegal building. A bank, believe it or not, actually has the right to foreclose on your loan if your building, if you have an illegal use of your building, like an illegal cellar apartment. I actually got approached by a hedge fund a couple of years ago, and they said, Bryan, let's find out all the apartments in New York City that are legal, and we'll go around and buy up the house. We'll get them their violations. We'll buy up the houses cheap, and then we'll fix them, and we'll make a lot of money. I told the hedge fund, thanks, but no thanks. And in fact, a lot of architects and engineers get in trouble because of this law, because they wink and nod and help put illegal apartments in cellars. As we saw in September, when about a dozen people were killed in flooding in cellar apartments, there's a lot of safety reasons for that. Lots of different tricks, like secondary kitchens in the kitchen, kosher kitchens or religious kitchens have been encouraged a lot in the last couple of years. A lot of people need a special kitchen just for certain times of the year. So these are types of that single family house again. Use group 2 is anything else. It is use group 2 could be a tall apartment building, or it could just be a 2-family house. This is a 1930s plan for the Mosholu, or looks like an Art Deco building up in the Bronx. And I can tell it's 1930s, by the way. This is where you get, when you become a little better at the building code, you'll say, wow, that stairway, it's just opening right into the hall. And, these little tricks, the elevator opening in the staircase, that tells you what years it's built. Because in this case, there's only one stairway because everybody has a fire escape outside their windows. And here's my favorite residential building in New York City, bar none. This is a conversion. This building was originally built as a hotel. It's over on West 70th Street. It is insanely cool. This is, of course, the Pythian. The Pythian is an apartment building today, but it was originally built as a hotel for Masons, Freemasons, which were a pretty powerful organization before the Depression. In fact, they built lots of buildings in New York City. This one was pretty cool. And who wouldn't want to have an apartment? That's an apartment window. Who wouldn't want to have an apartment with a 12-foot tall Egyptian pharaoh outside your window? No, excuse me, one on each side of your window. Now, is that the baddest bedroom you could ever imagine? So again, we think about conversion of older buildings, but this is just a brilliant, I believe it's a national landmark. It's really an amazingly stunning building. I love this picture because one night I talked about this building for years. And one night in class, a couple starts just absolutely busting out laughing in the back of the class. And I say, what's so funny? And she says, oh, that's our apartment. And they happen to live right here in the penthouse. So again, the point is that residential buildings are, they have to follow a lot of rules simply because when people live there, the common spaces are kind of a social contract. This is one of the reasons why things like Airbnb are illegal, because I call it the big wheel rule. If your kid's out playing in the hall, people coming in and out that aren't there all the time, which is one of the reasons why the city, in New York City, you can only lease properties for a minimum of 30 days. Again, history of land, we talk about the land use reforms over the years. I won't get too technical on this, but like many laws, the multiple dwelling law is one you're going to hear a lot, the MDL. Okay, there were various building codes. They did prior to 1968. Of course, you look at the building and it's prior to 1908, but you can get a quick feel for the buildings themselves. Of course, this is Lower East Side around 1900, where you can see just an incredible density. What do you see lots of? You see tons and tons of children. Now, that's kind of a good and a bad thing. Sadly, as we saw in the M12 class, the rate of death of children in 1900 was incredibly high. 150 children died in 1 year on one block. Think about that. And so again, the children are playing in the street. A lot of zoning was because these areas were so dense, the children were not safe playing in the street. No, they didn't have, video games and PS5s yet. So the kids weren't completely glued to their computers and brain dead and not exercising. They were out running around the street, having fun, causing problems, and getting hit by horses. So these are things we think about. Again, history of housing reforms, we think about, again, those old tenements and how they evolve. This is a project I was advising on recently where, again, an old tenement from the 1880s has evolved over the years. It went from number of, in this case, we look at, that's the weight of the floor, cellar through fifth floors. There are, in this case, they're counting rooms, okay? In this case, each room is an apartment. So number of dwelling units here, we got 18 apartments. Here it is, right here, 14 apartments, excuse me. And this is what's called an old code, old law tenement. Now, for the most part, you may not have to deal with this, but if you're doing stuff in downtown or downtown Brooklyn or old parts of Brooklyn or Queens, understanding these tenement laws is going to be part of understanding how the city plans for growth, as well as you being able to sell a property. This is a residential building, but it's got a C61 zoning. That means commercial zoning. So, hey, let's make the first floor into a beer pub. Over the years, as the city got denser, the laws changed, and they went from being these small houses with plenty of ventilation, then small house, bunch of new rooms on the inside with no windows, open up to the living rooms. Then a little more, they stick a new building in the backyard. They still exist. Then later on, by the 1870s, they're just shoving them in there. Lots and lots of people. You got your parlor, and then your kitchen, and then your bedrooms on the inside with no windows. No windows is disease, okay? So then we got, this is 4 apartments per floor. Going further up by the 1880s, a little further on, we got tons of apartments. By 1879, they say, look, you got to give at least a tiny little ventilation for these people to get a little fresh air, tiny bit of air. And when this is happening, tuberculosis is ravaging the city. These windowless rooms are absolutely decimating the city. Later on, by 1891, they say, let's add a space, a 3-foot space between the buildings. That'll let a little window in. Oh, and we've really advanced here. We have indoor toilets where you got to share your toilet with the 12 other people on the floor. Hey, that's still better than walking out to the backyard where the well and the toilet used to be. Well, now you've got a little fresh water and you got a toilet, so it's starting to be more sanitary, but still you've got these rooms with very minimum windows. Later on, they make them a little larger and then even larger with the newer laws. Use group 2, again, residential apartments like this, you can very often find this, which is called an I card. As you see, the place has a lot of bedrooms that don't have any windows. So, maybe that S is for a shaft. So actually they get a tiny bit of window from this shaft. And so that was really bad. And not coincidentally, the West Village was had a major problem with typhus and tuberculosis at that time because people lived in the dark, dank apartments. By the late 19th century, the rich were moving into fancy for security because the streets had gotten deadly and the one-family houses were being robbed. So richer people moved to the apartment buildings. The wealthy inhabitants of the super rich area of, don't laugh, Avenue D and the Lower East Side of Manhattan were moving up to the East 50s and West 50s into the new apartment buildings. Of course, another thing we might come across is SROs, single room occupancies. This was once a luxury hotel. A luxury hotel gets evolved over the years through a number of regulations and has become a single room occupancy where men pay $10 a month to stay in the hotel, and women. Pretty good deal if you can get it. A little bit of a challenge. Of course, lodging houses is a reminder of what it was like in the 19th century, how dense it was. People came in Hong Kong, they called them, you would literally get a 5x8 cubicle with chicken wire above. The chicken wire was actually not there to protect you. It was there so if a fire went off, a sprinkler would go through the chicken wire and soak you. Kind of gross, but this is a reality of the density. And these things still exist. They're leftovers. They are a grandfathered use and they still legally exist. In fact, when I was a commissioner of Manhattan, the fire department wanted me to shut one of these down And I reviewed it with them, and I reviewed it with the owner. And the reality was it was horrific, but it was legal. And because it was legal, I couldn't do anything about it. The thing was grandfathered. And although the fire department didn't like it by today's standards, they didn't want to vacate it. They wanted me to vacate it. And I said, sorry, the laws that I regulate, I wasn't allowed to vacate it. So this is an example of things that might be out. Again, they're in the Bowery in Brooklyn. Also, we think about things like lodging, different types of hotels. And a good one that I'd love to see somebody do more of. How about botels? Wouldn't you guys love if somebody like parked a cruise ship and you could rent apartments in a cruise ship? Oh, there's actually a couple places in Brooklyn where, again, some marinas where you can rent. And I know one guy tried to have a hotel series in a marina in Brooklyn before COVID. Of course, another residential use is called condo hotels. Well, these are not legal in New York City because you're not allowed to rent for less than 30 days. This one building got an exception. The building commissioner at the time varied the law just a little bit with advisory from the city planning. And they said, this building's in a manufacturing district, so you can't have residential. So people bought their condos and they wanted to lease them out, rent them out like they do in Florida, where, before Airbnb, they had condo hotels where you would rent your room out when you weren't there. Well, this one got an agreement here at 246 Spring. They got an agreement that they could have a 120-day limit. And that was kind of sometimes you be careful what you ask for. In this case, instead of being a hotel, they were a hybrid condominium hotel condo. So they could rent their room out for only 120 days a year, which wasn't enough. So not coincidentally, this place went bankrupt. I think it also had a little to do with the fact that it was called the Trump Soho. And around 2017, the name associations weren't so popular in the city, but that's the way the world goes. Other types of zoning, they've been constantly tweaking the zoning to try to figure out ways to make it a little better. One example today, the zoning was required. As I said, the form of buildings is based on the law. This little tiny notch difference doesn't sound like much, but it did affect how buildings are designed. And this what's called zoning for quality and affordability was a law that let them build buildings a little bigger, a little taller, with a little more bumpiness and a little more break in the street line that made them more friendly. Illegal uses. Okay, would you guys believe? Okay, youth hostels. Now, there are rare cases where things have to be grandfathered prior to 1961 or prior to 1916 or 1929. You got to check each one of these. Okay, a hostel, most hostels are illegal. Bed and breakfast, sadly, are illegal. Of course, this covers Airbnb as well. What you're doing, you're operating basically a hotel in a residential neighborhood. With a very rare exception of in a 1 and 2 family, you can have up to 2 guests. Other than that, bed and breakfasts are illegal in New York City. Now, upstate New York, usually each town will license in their own way, but in New York City, it's actually, sadly, illegal. Another great example of an illegal one is the pod hotels. A lot of people have been doing this and proposing this a lot lately, super high density. Good article today in the New York Post about 4 girls sharing a $5,000 a month apartment in Bushwick. I think they need their heads screwed on, but I guess it's a wonderful time. Alternatively, a lot of people have been trying to do this. Well, here's the secret. You can't, these are very, very illegal in New York City. Okay. In fact, they're so illegal when somebody did this at 30 there and shut it down, but they actually forced the owners to remove these cubicles from the building. Other illegal transient rentals, of course, Airbnb is illegal. In this case, this guy was the holy grail. He was great. This guy actually had the guts to something is very common in Hong Kong and in many countries around the world. This guy actually had a 12-foot apartment building down at the Jewish Socialist Center on, I think that's what the building's called, literally. Again, the previous immigrant group had, you can see the Stars of David on the building, but he took the top floor, which had been, I believe, the Jewish Forward. I think this was the newspaper building. And he cut it in half horizontally. So he took a 12-foot tall floor and made 2 5.5-foot tall floors. And people were kind of walking bent over between the 2 floors. And this guy was making a fortune collecting rents. This was illegal. It was discovered because they could see the air conditioners on 2 levels on the floors. And somebody narked, and the city vacated them. And in fact, sadly, 3 years trying to get me to get some legal stuff on this building. But because of this illegal problem on the 5th floor, I can't help her on what she wants to do on the 1st floor. Again, illegal crackdowns have been a challenge for illegal apartments for like sellers, but also illegal rentals. 4 beds per apartment. No more than 4 unrelated people per apartment. Okay. A lot of conversions happen. They're illegal. You can't put 6 beds in a hotel room. Yes, I know you can do it in London. Yes, I know you can do it in Amsterdam. Been there, done that. Yes, you can do it in anywhere else in the world. I don't care. You can't do it in New York City. And these get vacated all the time. One of these in Jackson Heights, Queens, a couple months ago, they got a $240,000 fine for 24 illegal beds, $10,000 per bed. And for all you technical heads, that's the actual legal bulletin that my good friend Tom Ferriello wrote to say this is illegal. Father, this is an old Protestant missionary hostel on the Upper West Side. And this is legal, still is legal, because the AYH is grandfathered. It's older than 1929, so they can still operate as a youth hostel. Other youth hostels, well, in this case, this is an example of what happens when they are illegal. This is my buddies at the OSE, the off apartments that are illegal. I work with them a lot, good and bad. And when I was a deputy in Brooklyn and especially in Manhattan, we did a lot of vacates together. And sometimes I told them they were wrong, but most of the time they were right. And in particular with Airbnb, we would very often throw people out. One time I vacated an illegal hostel in a building that was halfway under construction, but not finished in Harlem. The guys at 118th Street, they started working on it and they stopped because of the 2009 financial crisis, 2008. An Israeli guy came over, finished it up illegally with no permits and turned it into a youth hostel. And one night, in a January night in the cold, 1 o'clock in the morning, I had to throw an entire plane load of Norwegians that had flown in for a rave in New York City. And I had to throw them all out of the extremely illegal and unfinished and illegal seller apartment, you name it, building because of that illegal hotel. I vacated 150 people and screwed their vacation up a little bit. But what didn't happen is they didn't get killed from a fire. Again, grandfathered is the key word. That is a key element with non-conforming uses, which is uses that were there beforehand, or they're not allowed as per the current zoning. Again, with that, pre-1929, these houses like the, before 1929, the Plaza Hotel was actually a work. With regulation and zoning, one of the things they want to regulate is density. Now, density is, the size of a building, the height will actually change, will vary considerably. Another choice there is incentive zoning, where the city will, if you give apartments to the city or let the city put a lien on your apartment to allow permanent affordable housing that they will control, then they might let you build your building bigger. Now, there was quite the person that's paying $1,000 a month for the 2-bedroom and the person that's paying $2 million and $3,000 a month for the 2-bedroom. And there, at one time, there was what's called the poor door, where the subsidized people would come in one side of the building, the unsubsidized would come in the other. That's not allowed anymore in New York City, and they mix them up within the building. So you never know whether your neighbor is rich or poor, is paying $5,000 or is paying $1,000. Again, it's good and bad. It prevents stigmatization, but it also potentially prevents buyers, because a lot of buyers will refuse to buy in these buildings because they don't want to be part of a social experiment. Certain immigrant groups and investors from overseas will specifically avoid these buildings because there have been a lot of really troublesome cases where people that are paying that $1,000 a month have been actually teasing and abusing the people who are paying $5,000 a month for the same apartment and laughing at them, saying, we got the lottery and you can't do anything about it. Well, when people did that, that got a lot of people very mad, and a lot of investors now won't buy into these buildings. So it's a social experiment that sometimes has unexpected consequences, but there's a big financial bonus as a 20% affordable floor area that he's got to give away, but he gets a 30% bonus perhaps up on top. This whole concept changes, and you get on these lotteries, and there's tens of thousands of apartments that, if you, depending on your income level and the number of people in your house, you might get into one of these apartments, and you will potentially have a somewhat subsidized apartment for the rest of your life. It's kind of the new rent stabilization. Okay, let's move on from residential, keep going. Community facilities. Well, use group 3 is community facilities that are kind of residential. Convents, as an example, in Greenpoint, or down in Lower East or East Village, there's a little trick. In certain cases, if you're a community facility like a dormitory, you can actually build twice as large. So in this case, this community facility might have only been allowed to be 10 or 6 stories tall, but because it's a dormitory for NYU, boom, 15 stories tall. And you see this over and over and over, where NYU in particular and other universities also have picked up on this, and they'll build very, very much larger buildings than normal, and they will be dormitories for either staff or students. Again, other types of community facilities, not so fun, not NPISA. Hopefully you don't deal with those. Now when in a vertical, in this case, this building, 8 Spruce Street, was actually considerably taller because they put on the lower floors a school and some dormitories for students at a nearby hospital. And thus they made the top floors much, much taller. And as those floors got taller, they become more valuable. And this building originally was meant to be sold, but instead it became a rental. Use Group 3 colleges have this incredible zoning bonus, and they really have become one of the major income drivers of New York City. You know, a real estate that's close to a college, that's going to have a premium to it. But the universities themselves actually get a pretty big premium in their zoning, so they can build much larger. And again, today, a college creates jobs. Columbia University is how it hires professors and janitors and teachers, et cetera, but it also provides at their life sciences center, you know, tens of thousands of jobs for major cutting edge life science research, such as their Brain Institute. Same thing as the Fordham School of Law, part dormitory, part schools. They are great job drivers. On the other end, about the gray days of people's lives. So the city's been trying to change zoning. They did temporarily change the zoning to allow larger buildings for retirement homes and nursing homes. This idea was cute, but they ended up pulling it back. They decided not to do this for probably some political reasons. But for whatever the reason, they said, hey, if you're doing it for nursing homes, you can be a little taller. And that's an example of managing the uses and how it affects the size of a building. Also, use Group 4 is a very important thing. Doctors' offices. In the 1950s and 60s, when this law was written, doctors worked from their homes. They worked single offices at home, and they were community anchors. They did, the house calls. Today, they are in big medical facilities, et cetera. These can be things like other smaller schools as well. But the big picture is the idea of what the medical doctors, the dentists on a community basis were considered to be, more valuable. Use Group 5, a very important category, hotels. As we saw earlier, there's kind of that apartment hotel combination for the older apartment buildings. This is an example of a very old hotel that's always been a hotel. This is grandfathered, not as a hotel, it's always been a hotel, but what's grandfathered about it is the rooms are so small. I've never stayed here, but I've seen plans where the hotel rooms here at the Jane Hotel down in the Village are only about 5 to 6 feet wide. And again, that wouldn't be allowed today, but it's a factor. Now, zoning today for hotels, for 20 years, a lot of hotels were built. And then a lot of people got involved and they moved away from building more hotels. Obviously, there's a lot of hotels that have closed in the last couple of years because of COVID, and we're really rethinking the entire financial structure of the city now, as a lot of those hotels now are going to be converted perhaps to residential. We'll see. Many of them are in areas that can't be converted to residential, so they have a problem. Quintessential hotel, other than the Penn Plaza, which is being demolished as we speak, but not too far away, is the New Yorker Hotel. As you can see, the beautiful 1930s deco setback, making it a legendary skyscraper. However, while it is a wonderful attics down on the street, and for you trivia heads, up on the penthouse, Nikola Tesla lived and died back in 1941. Of course, what makes a hotel different? A hotel is for less than 30 days. Now, that sounds like Airbnb to me, right? Wrong. Airbnb is different from hotel. It's one of the reasons why it's illegal, because hotels have higher safety standards. They're built of, more alarms. There's a person at the front desk that knows you. There are people that have to check the floors frequently. That security level is not there with residential. Exit signs sounds crazy. They're not. And conversely, a lot of them are grandfathered. Another transient hotel, of course, the Holiday Inn downtown is an example. This was the first non-union building built in New York City over 20 stories. So that caused quite a bit of consternation and a lot of strikes by the construction. Is the penthouse of the Four Seasons Hotel, which I had really luxury suite. And this building was kind of cursed because first it was the owner of the building, a guy named Ty Warner. Ty Warner had gone from a middle-level manager, and 2 years later, he's a multi-billionaire because of Ty Beanie Babies. And of course, he stayed at the Four Seasons Hotel one night in New York City, and he liked it so much, he bought the building, literally. And after that happened, of course, he was a little careless, perhaps, with his money, and not much longer later, he was jailed for tax evasion. So later on, they named it the Michael Jackson Suite, also unfortunately kind of cursed. And I don't know what they call it today, but it's about a $50,000 night suite. Now, commercial uses. We think those use groups again, we targeted 1 for houses, 3 for churches and dorms, 15. Now, most of them are use group 6. That's the local use stores. And let's take a look. Now, this is not use group 6. This is the middle of Times Square, of course. Just to the left is building a health design. On the right is, in the middle is actually, I thought it was funny because this billboard is actually owned by the Chinese government. So they put Chinese news propaganda or news, depending on your perspective, up on the screen. I like this picture. It's kind of funny because this is actually an advertisement for a province I taught in China called Shandong. Very interesting, ironic that it appeared. So let's take a look. 6A. These uses are really important for commercial real estate, guys. You've got to know this, okay? 6A, retail or service. 6B is offices. So B, it sounds like a boring number, 6B, that's all of the offices, okay? 6, general stores and stuff, but these are all use group 6. Again, local commercial, like a small bar, House of Cred. Now being emulated all over the world, all over the country, and this is part of my lecture in China, is the understanding of the importance of street life. Now, this was a picture, of course, this is one of the very few legal cafes, on sidewalk cafes in New York City prior to COVID. As I said, this is probably the one great thing, if anything great came out of COVID, is that people are now allowed to eat out on the street. I know it's kind of paranoid in these dump bubbles, et cetera, but that gives the street a little life. And that was especially important when there was no life on the street. But that commercial overlay concept where commercial's on the ground floor, residential's above, is an important factor in zoning. And again, we see the residential districts for the commercial districts near the main streets, like in this case, Northern Boulevard in Queens. And those commercial districts make both convenience for people to not have to get in a car to go everywhere, as well as, again, the feeling of excitement of people being out of their houses. People aren't sitting in their houses all day. And that is such an important thing to the viability of communities. I was recently advising somebody on a residential community in the exurbs, very far suburbs in Maryland. And I told him, and he asked, Bryan, if you could do one thing to make this different, what would you do? And I said, John, I want you to add big front porches in a big suburban community. He said, Bryan, who cares about front porches? I said, let me explain something. If you have front porches that work and are a good size, people will go out on them and they'll stay out on them and they'll socialize and they'll encourage street traffic and pedestrian flow. With that, new urbanism is something that the key is to understand this magic of street life. And that is one of the key elements that they try to regulate with land use and zoning. In fact, in the last 20 years, New York City's encouraged it by trying to push that magical mix of commercial and residential. Obviously, COVID has thrown all of this for a loop, but we were doing pretty good before that in terms of that mix of residential. Mafusa, I don't speak. I'm not sure what language that is, but feel free to speak in English. We'll love to hear your dialogue. Is that, let's see, Kafutsa. I don't know what language that is, but whatever. If you're going to do chat, again, you're more than welcome to talk to individual people. But if you're going to broadcast, it would help me if it were in English, just so I know what you're talking about. But if you don't, that's okay too. Again, more commercial overlays. Again, the secret sauce. This is one of my favorite new areas that I've discovered recently out in Queens. This is 8th Avenue, also known as Chinatown in Brooklyn. I call it Chinatown number 3. Chinatown number 1 being Lower Manhattan, number 2 being Flushing, and now number 3 being 8th Avenue in Brooklyn. Neat area, lots of fun, and very open, and a great pedestrian use group 6. Again, commercial 6D, E, and F are kind of special uses like firehouse. Sounds crazy, but you don't want them going everywhere. They're loud. Clubs, lodges. There used to be a lot of clubs were big many years ago. Okay. Use group 6 was most of the city. 7 to 9 are kind of specialty uses. Things like a hardware store. Now, why is a hardware store different? Hardware store is different because it often stores like powerful chemicals and stuff. Okay. Use group 9, use group 8, like billiards, and use group 9, a billiard hall. I think it's more than 2 or 4 pool tables, and you go from being a bar to a billiard hall. And again, these 1950s concepts of billiards bad, they wanted to regulate them more. So the zoning still today puts them as a different class. And it is what it is. Again, caterers, that's a big debate just because people be going in and out all the time. And I would argue that most of the restaurants in New York City today would be classified as caterers because they only cook for off-site. Use group 10 to 12, again, large retail, local manufacturing, make robots or something. And spaces. Now, there used to be, for all you old timers, you might have heard the term cabaret. No, not the Joel Grey and the Broadway play, but a cabaret was actually a legal classification. It still is. Believe it or not, up until about 2 years ago, you had to have special permission to have places where people were allowed to dance. In fact, on the certificate of occupancy, it would say cabaret, 500 people, no dancing allowed. As crazy as that sounds. Well, of course, that wasn't, like any law, you have to ask the question, why did they pass that law? And unfortunately, with building and zoning, you have to answer the question, who died? And very sadly, there were some very large incidents where people were dancing and people got trampled or fires happened, a lot of people died. So these are, anytime you see laws, they may seem crazy today, but they made sense at one point. Large retail stores, more than 10,000 square feet, the city very carefully regulates them. This is one of the reasons why you don't see any Walmarts. Now, Target made a lot of political contributions, so they got a lot of big loopholes. So Target has 10 or 15 stores in New York City, but other large big boxes have a harder time getting in. So there's very limited times when you can use group 10. 13 to 15 waterfront amusement parks. These are higher annoyance. Can you imagine a roller coaster going by your window every 5 minutes? Screaming people. Oh, that'd be annoying. So use group 15 is extremely limited, but don't worry, it's only in 2 places in the entire city. One is Coney Island, and the other one is a tiny single building, which used to be a great boxing hall on Knapp Street in Brooklyn. Use group 60 to 18 are manufacturing uses, heavy pollution, light manufacturing. 2 is kind of heavier transportation noise. And use group 18, the worst of all, that's the heavy industry, the heavy transport. Think of the question of, is my kid going to get run over playing outside of the house? Well, it probably is outside of a lead smelter. Okay, so that's the way you think about use group 1 to 18. As a commercial, that's a big deal. Now this, again, if you've been at this for a while, you might remember physical culture establishments. Well, congratulations. Up until December 2021, you could not open a massage parlor or even a gym without a special permit from the BSA. Well, congratulations. As of December, the massage parlors and gyms can rest easy because they no longer need this special permit. And I actually say that's really, really good, because I won't say for the massage parlors, but I will say a lot of small gyms were really going through hell dealing with these regulations and paying huge fines for setting up early. And they'd have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars just to get this stupid approval. And finally, the city got rid of it. It seems like some one person may have gone around and phoned in 50 or 60 of these. And maybe with that, they got rid of it. Yay. But gyms shouldn't, the argument is that a place where people get healthy, a gym has become a new business. A lot of storefronts that closed, gyms became very popular as a alternative. Now, the big concept of zoning, of course, is also we think about mixed use. We think about this great diagram. Where would you like to be? In a single, I love this because this is like the building I did on, one of the buildings I did in Manhattan. And it actually is almost like a commercial, like a mall on the ground floor. Instead of, the mall on the ground floor, lots of commercial spaces and residential up top. Alternatively, you could have, what's the problem here? Anybody like asphalt? You don't need the streets. The streets of New York City somebody said they're 38% of the area of New York City, the streets. And the parking, of course, same problem. As we go further out in New York City or in any area, you have to make sure your parking works. In fact, you think you got a big lot and then you find, oh man, I got to provide a bunch of parking spaces. Usually at least one per unit, but depends on every area. But you can imagine this suburban life. You're in your house, you have a parking space, you take your car out, you drive on the big wide roads, you go to the store, you park in the parking lot, you go shop, get back in, you drive to the next store, go in, park, eat up your parking space, you go to the medical office, then you go to your work, and then all these parking spaces are being used. And you can see how this becomes a very different world. I love this diagram because it really shows how, again, I'm not necessarily saying these buildings are really cool, but these people were screwed when it came to COVID. In fact, these are the people who were the first to move out when the city decided to lock down the world, because all of a sudden you couldn't use your elevator and you're on the 50th floor. I got 2 words for you: Florida. I'm out of here. And that a lot of people left because they were afraid to ride their elevators. Again, we talk about mixed use. Again, we think about this building being, again, community facilities as well as residential and some commercial spaces, all of them within one structure. Ultimate expression of mixed use. I hiked the High Line this weekend, actually. I'm happy to report that Dubai on the Hudson actually does have better pedestrian traffic these days. I was quite surprised. I've been watching all through COVID, where I've been going to Hudson Yards for the last 2 years, using it as an indicator because it was the newest and, in fact, the largest real estate development in New York City and in the United States. And I use the mall down at the ground floor as a good indicator. At one point in September of 2020, I went to the mall, and guys, I took a picture of the entire interior of the mall. I could see all 3 floors. I could see, in looking at roughly 100,000 square feet of space, I could see 3 people. 3 people, not 3,000, not 30,000, 3 people. Again, things are evolving, things are coming back. Again, what made mixed use work here? Again, infrastructure, brand new subways, ferry line, transit, of course, retail spaces, art spaces. By the way, many would say this area is good because it doesn't have very good transit. I hate to say that a lot of the really newer commercial spaces are saying we don't want to be near subways. Maybe that's elitist, maybe that's a safety factor, but that's actually been an issue raised by developers, not developers, but land potential tenants of late. I don't want to be near the subways because I don't want the crime near my office. That's a pretty powerful statement. And it's because there was a big debate whether it would really hurt this community as they built it not so close to the subways. Again, arts, offices, apartments. There's a building called the Bloomberg Building, which is an arts shed dedicated to museum stuff. Millions of square feet of offices, things like Google. And I jokingly call this District 1 the headquarters of the New World Order, because a lot of the major global media companies and technology companies are all putting their New York headquarters in this area. Again, condos and hotels. I think they got the Edge. I haven't been up here yet, dying to go. I hope somebody's gotten a good shot. If you've been up it and have a good picture, please send me an email. I'd love to see a picture from up here. This is an observation deck at the top of 1 Hudson Square, I think the building is. And that observation deck is you're 1,000 feet above ground, and there's only a sheet of glass between you and the ground. Supposedly the view is pretty cool. And as I was hiking the High Line the other day, I did look up and see there was a ton of people up here. So it is nice to see the tourists coming back, maybe the people coming out and seeing the city. Again, mixed use creates a pedestrian flow that people want to be around. People don't want to walk through a suburban. There are thousands of people, both for safety as well as energy. And you might walk around and meet an artist or, whatever. And that's the nature of New York City. And that, if it comes back like it was, that will be the secret sauce that jacks property values and real estate values. I would argue that, a place with good safety and good public traffic and good parks, those are properties that become more valuable. Now, back to the zoning, we think about this is a typical zoning map in the area over by the United Nations. The funny part is the United Nations in 1945, when they built it, a guy named Bill Zeckendorf got together the land. He was going to build an airport here on the East River. He's going to build a big, huge airport for seaplanes, by the way. My grandfather used to fly seaplanes into the seaplane base, which is actually still there at 31st Street on the East River. It's legally still there, actually. But the meatpacking district, where all the nasty, smelly, stinky meatpacking areas was the United Nations, an industrial area. They rezoned that industrial area. So all the buildings around the UN actually don't have windows facing UN, because the windows would have faced the meatpacking district and the wonderful sound in the morning of cows being slaughtered. Oh, charming. So the buildings actually faced away. So when they built the United Nations, I'm sure the neighbors at Tudor City were very happy to go from having a meatpacking area to politicians, although some would say there's not much of a difference. But with this zoning map, you can see different areas. It's R10 here along Park Avenue. That's actually residential zoning. In fact, there are chunks of Park Avenue below, down in the 30s that are still residential buildings. Some of them are so old that they're before this zoning, and they're actually commercial buildings. I was recently asked to sell a hotel here that the guy he wanted to convert it to residential. And I said, hey, that works. Another building around here, which I can't show because they're illegal still, they wanted their zoning allowed them to be residential. And they had been a hotel. They were grandfathered. And then they became residential. And then they wanted to go back to being a hotel. and they couldn't. They weren't allowed to go back. And this Israeli investor swore up and down he thought we could definitely make it work. And we said, look, we make no promises. We don't think it's going to work. And in fact, we couldn't make it work, even though we warned him. But he wasn't really happy. And in fact, he declared bankruptcy on the project not that much later and walked away from it. But the good news is it's still a beautiful, beautiful residential building. Again, what happens as things change? This is a great picture. I hope you guys understand what you're looking at here. If you've been to Madison Square Lake, it was going to be the Metropolitan Life building. Of course, the MetLife Tower, MetLife Tower here, they were going to build a huge, huge 100-story office building. What happened? Hint, they started construction in 1928. Yep. Well, it's November 1929, and we just ran out of money. Okay, put a roof on it, and we'll call it a day. That's what they did. Now, the funny part is, I worked on some projects here. There's still steel inside the building, so they could actually put a 100-story building on top of this. So this is probably the most over-engineered building in New York City. But who knows? Maybe they'll add the extra 70 stories someday. I think they would be grandfathered, by the way. No, they wouldn't. The 100-story building was under the old zoning. So today, if they rebuilt it, they may only be able to build 5 or 10 stories more because the area was effectively downzoned in 1961. But they could go and ask for special permission districts. Now, there's several hundred zoning districts, a lot of different residential districts, each one balancing different functions. First, the main use, commercial, in this case, commercial. C4 is central business district. The 6 indicates the parking density or the business density. Of course, you don't worry about the parking density in Midtown Manhattan because there is no parking required. And then there's a suffix like the A, which means it's contextual, so you're limited in height. So in this case, you've got C4, central district, 6, parking density, and an A, contextual. Now, once you get that, you got to look up what all the different things mean. There's hundreds of pages of the translation of how it affects something like this, at M10. This is actually in the middle of Midtown, right next to the Bryant Park. Now, for instance, the old Ivy building was right here, right in the M16 district. It's an old 20-story factory. But the guys just 10 feet away behind him were rezoned into a commercial residential district. So they got to build a 30-story, very, very, very expensive apartment building, which the other building is not allowed to do because it's technically still a manufacturing. Now, of course, the manufacturing in this area used to be garments, the garment center district. So that this area was, with the M1, they were allowed to build really big hotels. 6 means 10 FAR. So the M16 was the holy grail for hotel guys because they could build a super tall 30 or 40-story hotel with a 10 FAR in very cheap land. Again, we think about bulk, you go through all the rules for each. First, you come up with a zoning district, and then in some cases, it's smart to show what the building might look like. I've got to do a diagram of a building with or without the buying of the adjacent lot. A really neat building on 42nd Street versus in fact, most of this building, by the way, is underground. This is actually the lot line. You only see the boxes above it. Actually, no, you laws. You see those little crazy setbacks all over New York City? They're actually part of the law. Setback, for instance, on a narrow street, you go up a certain height, and then you set back at 2.7 to 1, and that setback allows for a little more light to get down to the street. Again, as I said earlier, your view is not protected by zoning. As of right means your neighbor at any given time, you bought this condo with this beautiful $1 million view of the Empire State Building. Wow, isn't that beautiful? Look at that gorgeous sunset. We know it's a sunset, by the way, because he's to the west of the Empire State Building and the shadows are on the Empire State. So this nice western sunset with a nice dirty red air behind it. And then a year later, oops, a skyscraper has been built right in front of you. Now, if you're a voyeur, hey, that's great. Everybody can look out your window and you can look at all your neighbors. But unfortunately, it's not terribly good for your property value. So this guy just lost $1 million on the value of his property. And the property ownership is as of right. There's nothing you can do about it. Now, again, we talk about the bulk. There's lots of different rules. My favorite is 2347 and 23662, I think it is, which is the setbacks regulations. And the developer standpoint, these little tricks are ways, as you look around the city, you'll start seeing all these little bumps and grinds and balconies and stuff. Those are kind of free bonus space. Of course, the idea of New York City zoning was it actually inspired art. The 1916 law, after it went to to be protested all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Once it was approved, it was very inspiring as this new world that could come about because of new steel and elevators and technology. My favorite artist in the world, Hugh Ferris, this in the 20s, is saying, well, this is what the city might look like based upon these new laws that New York has passed. And many of you might recognize these images from the movies like Metropolis or perhaps Blade Runner, depending on your perspective. But they were trying to envision the future. And as I said, in every class, as a broker or a salesperson, your job is to figure out what the future will be. That is what's going to make you valuable. In this case, Hugh Ferris, I actually saw these images. Like, I have unfortunately a French version of this book, because these great skyscraper designs from the 1920s in New York was actually found at a presentation I saw at the Centre Pompidou in Paris. And in Paris, what you might find, who cares? Well, Paris has no skyscrapers. With the exception of La Défense, the French are, in a way, they're jealous of New York, which is funny because for 100 years, New York City wanted to be like Paris, and now Paris wants to be like New York. One of the great ironies, one of my students is a male model. He was modeling in Paris a couple of years ago, and you talk about how style changes. And instead of he was backstage, he was getting he wasn't very happy, by the way. He was paid 5,000 euros for his modeling. He's a handsome guy, and yet the funny part is what he didn't like was after taxes he only got 1,200. So he actually paid 3,800 in taxes. Well, what was funny was backstage they were saying, "Oh, très chic." You would think that everything was very chic, but instead of très chic, they would say, and without them knowing where he was from, they said très Brooklyn. As to the Parisians, Brooklyn was the ultimate in style. Of course, the zoning setback from more time. This is a very simple diagram, and then go to the moon with your height. And that is the zoning diagram that became the Empire State Building. Ironically, by the way, the Empire State Building was originally designed to be built not in New York, but it was actually going to be built in Cleveland. Cleveland in the 1920s was one of the greatest cities of the United States, very powerful economically, and a lot of oil in Cleveland, yes. And the Pennsylvania and Ohio and New York oil fields were some of the biggest in the world from Standard Oil. And well, of course, the Depression hit, and Cleveland didn't get its skyscraper. Minkin, I forget the name of the developer, moved the building to, of course, Fifth Avenue, where it is today. Now, the irony, of course, is there's a lot to be learned if anybody's been to Cleveland. A reminder of a once great city, incredible economic and innovation, total cutting edge Silicon Valley powerhouse circa 1920. And today, Cleveland has a lot of challenges. It's a reminder that cities, if not properly balanced through zoning and land use planning, can die. It's a very important thing to learn. Cities can have lifespans just like buildings and humans. Special permit, special approval. The architect was a psychotic guy from Denmark. I am Björk Ingels and I'm special and I want to build a pyramid. Well, luckily for him, a really powerful New York City developer named Durst said, okay, this is a crazy design, but we really want to build it. And sure, build it. Now, I knew from day one they were going to get screwed because when you have slopes like this, you're going to have leaks. And I've been told that not only are, of course, the apartments are half the size they would be because of the slanting walls, but again, apparently there's, from a structural perspective, a lot of leaks, things to think about. But the manufacturing use is, this is the old power plant, the power plant for the subway, for the IRT line. And this power plant, and nobody ever pays attention to it, but someday, very soon, everybody's going to be surprised because this power plant is going to become a museum. And it is going to, if anybody's been to the Tate Modern in London, you know that you can take an old industrial shed from a power plant and you can turn it into one of the great museums of the world. And a lot of the very wealthy and powerful in New York City have been lobbying for decades to make this happen. So again, the city made a big exception to make this really cool and totally incorrect shape for zoning. They said you can ignore the zoning as long as you have special permission from the city. Because in the end, it was just the city that determines what the zoning is. And of course, there's our friend again, the New Yorker Hotel. And in its glory days, how amazing it was as it all lit up. They just don't have the heroin addicts like they do today. This is 47th Street. from Fifth Avenue, you can see the old buildings, they had these little setbacks so that everybody would get fresh air. These buildings were built in 1920 where air conditioning was a novelty or didn't exist at all. So air conditioning determined buildings. The idea is you've got a certain amount of floor area, but you can build your building twice as tall as you go up. Again, setbacks in lower suburban districts, maybe there's a peak, you can maybe build 25. Very often they might have a dormered roof as a way of sneaking an extra floor in. Now, of course, in setbacks, sometimes they go a little crazy. And Park Avenue South, where they did some really crazy setbacks and came up with a stunning building. Unfortunately, they need to wash the windows a little more often, and they might be able to appreciate it. But other than that, it's an amazing building that actually just used the regular laws. The same laws that create a simple glass box also created this very amazing structural shape. Of course, the concept of zoning is floor area. Floor area ratio, 10,000 feet. So if you only have an FAR, you're zoning, let's say a C11 district, you only have an FAR of 1. Okay, so you might, well, I don't think there is a C11 to be overlays. But the point is, with an FAR of 1, you might do 4 stories, or well, let's go M11 because you can't build 4-story commercial. In this case, you can do 4 stories on a quarter of the lot, or 2 stories on half of the lot. And all this stuff, you got maybe 2.5 stories if you know what you're doing. Now, that gets back to what is floor area? This is one of the biggest questions that brokers ask about. Guess what? New York City is totally different from the rest of the universe. Yes, New York City will let you deduct, as per the REBNY, the Real Estate Board of New York Handbook, they let you deduct a lot more. So usually if you're trying to rent an office space that says that you buy 900 square feet of carpet and you cover it, but you're going to pay as if it's 1,200 square feet because they count the public areas. You got to pay for portions of the bathrooms and portions of the elevators and portions of all these other things that you're going to use. And that is considered part of your gross floor area. So again, that happens all the time where you say it's a 1,200 square foot apartment, but it's only 900. You measure it. And it's because of the walls and maybe that cellar storage area would normally be part of your house or part of your apartment, but they're off of your demised space. The line between apartments or stores or something, that's called the demising wall. And that divides the 2 spaces legally. Again, floor area tricks out there. There's a lot of ways to get floor area. Putting windows in a common stairway, roof parapets, bay windows. All these are some of the many. Of course, the best way of all is what we call an iceberg. This is a house in London, but many houses in New York City do the same thing. I think this is Abramovich's house in London, although I don't think he owns it anymore. I guess the world changes. But again, he wasn't allowed to build taller on Billionaires Row in London, which is also known as Bishop's Lane up in the Hampstead area. Again, ironic, Hampstead used to be the robbers and highwaymen's place where good people would never go because they would be robbed. And 100 years, 200 years later, it's the fanciest place in the city. And of course, 20 years later, it's empty because a lot of the Russian oligarchs have had their places seized. So again, we see the evolution of places, and never forget what's hot today may not be hot tomorrow. In 1880, the wealthiest neighborhood in New York City was Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn. Things to think about. Today, the wealthiest neighborhood you'd think is Park Avenue, but no, it's West 57th Street is getting pretty hot now. So again, you can see for zoning floor area, I said you have an FAR 1. Well, actually, everything below ground doesn't count. I had a client, he's the inspiration for the movie Billions. And he actually wanted a lift. He wanted to design the building, and he was willing to pay millions of dollars to have a 5-car parking space, where he was normally only allowed to have 1. And he actually was set up. We put an elevator, designed an elevator for the work. As I said, you might get 2.5 stories. In houses, you see a lot of slant roof houses in the outer boroughs. That's because there's a tiny deduction that says if you're between 5 and 8 feet, it doesn't count as floor area. Again, why did they do this? It was for understanding of the laws before it. In apartment buildings today, you might get a deduction for floor height has been a big dilemma as well. I taught some people in my class about 5 years ago in my zoning class I taught at Brew College. And one of the students was very excited because I told him there was no legal limit to the height of a floor. And I said, hey, you can do a 300-foot floor if you want and jack the building up. Well, he was working for a company called Raphael Vignoli, an architect I once worked for 20, 30 years ago. Well, Vignoli, not much later, designed a building that was going to have a 250-foot tall floor. So the city changed the line. I like to think I may have been involved in this problem. I'd have to call that guy and find out whether he was very excited when I gave him the idea. And I think he ran back to Raphael and they literally built a building with a 250-foot tall floor so it could push the whole thing up. Again, pop-up roofs, that's another thing where you just get every square inch of floor area you can. One of these is illegal. I won't tell you which one, but, and actually I advised on one of them in court, but people find ways to add a lot of tricks these days and problems. It used to be you could just pop up the roof and do cool stuff. Now, the Americans with Disabilities Act, a federal and very powerful law, has changed. So now if you have access to the roof, if it's public access, you have to provide an elevator. And that's a really big cost because you're running your elevator further up. And if you haven't done it before, it's very, very difficult cost. I was at an open house recently on 93rd Street, and they did a really nice job where they came up, half of the roof was for the penthouse, and the other half of the roof was for the public. And the simple reality is in New York City, rooftop access is a really, really big thing, but legally you actually have to provide rooftop access to everybody, which includes people in wheelchairs. So elevators are required. Yard regulations, again, we look at, because you got to have a little light. We talked about that with the skyscrapers, but 30-foot rear yards are required in most modern buildings with a bunch of exceptions. And the idea in a residential district is you've got 30 feet, I've got 30 feet. So we got about 60 feet open here. And that's good value. Again, Mafusa, if you're, I'd really appreciate if you're going to send messages to everyone, please do it in English so we can all read it. Thanks. Again, zoning in yards, we think about, when we talk about buildings, we look at this, the perimeter of the site, and then because of both fire codes and zoning, you have to have setbacks on the sides. They may say you have to have 10 feet setback on one side, or maybe your neighbor's house is too close and you have to set back a long way from them, even though just because they were there first, well, that actually matters. So in this case, you have a front yard setback, which everybody has, and a rear yard setback with a garage. These are, why is the garage back there? Because believe it or not, until 1950, you were not allowed to park in the street in New York City. Kind of crazy. Again, and now hype of New York City goes to great lengths to find ways to incentivize both buildings and parks. Now, in fact, they've actually, this idea called privately owned public spaces is a very important one. They gave developers bonuses. Hi, you give me a nice little park on the ground floor and I'll let you build a 20% taller building. Ooh, that's pretty sweet. In fact, that bonus, that FAR bonus, is a lesson that's been learned around the world. In fact, this does in Bangkok, Thailand, where they are similar to ours, trying to come up with ideas where they can encourage growth by giving bonuses for parks. If you've ever been to Bangkok, easily flooding, insane traffic places in the world. I've never done full traffic there, so that's another story. I designed a bank there in 1997. It was built one day and opened the day before the Asian financial crisis. And if you don't know what happened in July 1st, 1997, it tipped off a financial crisis that was the first time the whole global economy almost collapsed in the last 30 years. Many would say it was an example of what was to come. But anyway, long story short, we think about, as the world looks at our strategy, plaza outside with a specific number of seats, a couple of trees when necessary, and they got to build the building 20% taller. Same thing here, hands, got to keep it clean, art on the walls, seats, they follow the rules, they add some trees, they get to build a taller building. There's our block again. Other incentives, we talk about transit improvements. This is one of the newest ones, of course, which is One Vanderbilt, just recently completed a couple of years ago, and they're still fitting it out, but they got to build about 20 stories taller because they spent several $100 million helping to make what's going to be very important, called the Long Island Railroad's East Side Access. If you guys don't know, sometime not 2022, but it looks like 2023, the Long Island Railroad is actually coming into Grand Central. They've actually dug a huge cavern underneath Vanderbilt Avenue, and that cavern is about to become 12 new tracks for Long Island Railroad. You're going to be able to get your train to the Hamptons from Grand Central instead of Penn Station. And of course, another place with a big observation deck I have yet to go to. Hope anybody's been up there. If anybody's been to the One Vanderbilt observation deck, definitely send me a picture. Cantilevers, again, there are many ways and tools in creating larger buildings and more efficient buildings. It's very common today that people do this type of cantilever. And of course, the cantilever's here because, well, these old houses might be historic or just old, and they want to keep them, or they can't get the tenants out. So they might choose to build a building that cantilevers out above it. They buy the air rights. They do what's called a zoning lot assembly, and they buy the air rights and they make the building taller. Where these guys might have been allowed to be 10 stories, 10 stories, 10 stories. Now it's 4, 4, 24. And that's some of the concept of lot combination by the definition of family. In fact, the building actually is pretty smart. They spell it out, page 335. I think I got the author to add this because it's such a legal morass in New York City. Now, the federal law says, again, who is allowed to be here? A family, which is no size limit, a directly related family, and 2 boarders or 3 unrelated people. Now, they've pretty much expanded it to 4 people, but the state law still rules. One or more, what is a family? One or more persons related by blood marriage or legal adoption. Now, this sounds crazy, but this is one of the reasons, whatever your opinion on it, this is one of the reasons why the United States government, the Supreme Court, allowed gay marriage. Because people, when they get married, they transfer their rights to their partners legally. And that was the Windsor case, which was the name of the case, that 2 women wanted to have each other, do their thing. So that was their gig. Again, in brokerage and real estate, we have to have a brutally, mercilessly open mind and treat everybody, whatever their lifestyle, is equal in the eyes of the law and the land. So families can be exactly that. But what you can't be is more than a family and 2 boarders. So that's why 1 + 2, minimum is 3 people. You're not allowed to have more than 3 people in an apartment. I know New York City kind of expands it to 4 people, but the point is these laws, the MDL, the laws, particularly part of the MDL is called the loft law. And this was an added law that allowed for all of the illegal lofts in New York City, particularly in Soho and parts of Brooklyn, to become legal. Ironically, the funny part is many of the tenants don't want it to be legal, because if it becomes legal, then they have to pay higher rent. So a lot of the tenants are actually fighting their owners, making their buildings legal. Crazy stuff. Habitable rooms. It's important to think about what actually a room, what a room is. What is a bathroom? We talked about this in the construction. Habitable, occupiable rooms. This is, hold on for a second. Apartments that, for instance, this is a very fancy apartment in what's called a classic 6. It looks like about a classic 8 though. So what's considered a room? Again, this is again how the world's changed from 19 service elevator, and then the maids' quarters over here. And so they would cook and serve, and then go out to the dining room. And then the owners of the house, of course, they would be pretty separate from it. And in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4 bedrooms, a living room, dining room, very fancy. Technically, these 7 are legal rooms. Really, you could argue that the servants' quarter is too, a full kitchen. And they're legal rooms because they have windows and they're at least 80 square feet. Okay, in cellars. Now, one of the other problems is a lot of people have problems with illegal apartments in cellars. This can get you in a lot of trouble as a broker. Do not rent illegal cellar apartments. If you're not sure, call me. I'll even help you. Send me an email. I'll help you out. I'll literally, I can tell any building in the city, I'll tell you 5 seconds, whether it's a legal cellar apartment or not. Or very often people will take a 1 family and turn it into a 4. This one, you can tell it was kind of fake. Obviously, the toilet's like 6 inches from the wall. Not a terribly comfortable thing. But that said, there are lots of legal uses for basements, cellars, accessory to the apartment above. In very rare cases, like in hilly areas where it might open to the back, there are legal cellar apartments, but they're rare. And most of them are illegal. And as I said, 12 people died in them in September. Okay. So please don't rent illegal apartments. And if somebody dies in one of them, don't think they won't go after your license. And more importantly, here's the real kicker. If you rent, if anybody want 2 years of rent for free, here's what you do. You find a cellar or basement apartment that's not on a C of O, that's an illegal apartment, but it has at least 2 ways out. So it's illegal, but it's safe. Okay. You'll call the Department of Buildings yourself and you put the violation on your own apartment. And because you know your apartment's illegal. So you let the inspector in, the inspector writes a violation to the owner saying the apartment's illegal. At that point, they have rented you an illegal space. So what is their lease? Their lease is null and void because a contract that has an illegal representation is itself illegal. You know how the apartment, they can't evict you. You no longer have to pay rent. And they have to spend 2 years getting you evicted from that illegal but safe apartment. I tell you, because I want to remind you as real estate people helping usually the landlords, I want you to make sure the landlords stay in line because again, it's a pretty dangerous thing. Again, that accessory apartments we talked about, mother and daughter. This is a great, broker did a really good line on Zillow, which I was very impressed by. He said, a mother-daughter, you can't say mother-daughter apartments, okay? Mother-daughter, New York City are prohibited from using the term in marketing efforts as it implies the house is a two-family or has two apartments. This law may change soon, but it has not changed yet. Two-family house is a two-family house and a one-family is a one-family. There are no gray areas. You either have a one or a two. I had a student recently list a 2.5 family house in Sunset Park. And I very gently sent her an email. I said, look, this is an illegal listing. Please be careful. You're doing this wrong. And she said, look, my owner told me to do this. But I literally called her broker. I said, look, dude, this is the wrong way to do it. And he changed the listing. He said two, with accessory basement. He did accessory to the unit. He changed his terms. Again, he would have gotten in trouble for calling it a mother-daughter or an accessory apartment. Now, of course, in real estate, in New York City, we have to think of every square inch of extra space. We talked about the cellars, the basement, the duplex apartments, one of the best duplexes of all, of course. Apartment buildings, people pay $1,000 more to know that 2 or 3 weeks a year, they can sit on the rooftop and lounge. Of course, rooftops in New York City are that very special space. One of my favorite books is a book called Up on the Roof. It is a pre-drone helicopter trip over New York City with all of the really insanely cool rooftop spaces up there. Of course, parking is another part of zoning. Believe it or not, you're not allowed. This is hard to imagine, everybody. What if I told you you're never allowed to park in front of your building in a residential building? Yes, I know everybody does it. Everybody parks in the car in the driveway in front of the garage. Illegal. In this case, the guy actually cut his own curb cut and parks sideways in his front yard. Illegal. This guy goes out to the side and exits. Illegal. These are potential problems and could screw up a closing. I say this really importantly also because the banks are becoming jerks. I'm saying this in a complimentary way to them. I've got a number of lawyers I advised on a project last week. The banks used to not care about a lot of stuff, and now they're cracking down really, really hard on buildings. Okay, so please be aware that things like illegal parking, multiple families illegal, they can get you in a lot of trouble as a broker for misrepresentation. But also, if you say that's a parking space, you're misrepresenting, and potentially that buyer can come back at you later if they get a parking violation, and they could potentially even nullify the deal. Remember, any contract written with fraud, that contract is void. Never forget that. Again, a lot of the new development in New York City is trying to be experimental. We pay $30 for each ferry ride people take in New York City, but ferries are a big potential growth driver for areas like the Long Island City and Greenpoint waterfronts. Bikes have also been a big debate, somewhat successful, somewhat not. A lot of people love the city bikes. The guy did it as a nonprofit, saying how wonderful he was going to be and how he was doing it out of the goodness of his heart to do bikes as a nonprofit. He got Citibank to pay $100 million to basically have mobile billboards. And then, surprise, surprise, he gets a buyout and takes $1 billion out from his nonprofit. Just saying. But again, people are trying to think about new ways of thinking about cities, electric cars, electric scooters, all those have a fact. Well, believe it or not, we've been thinking about electric cars longer than you might think. In fact, this is an advertisement for Edison electric vehicles. They say the electric automobile will quickly and easily take precedence over all other types of motor vehicles, said Mr. Edison. I'm not kidding, guys. In 1901, they thought by 1902, all the cars in New York City would be electric. Well, he's off by 120 years, but you get the idea. Of course, the zoning today requires things like electric charging stations in buildings and stuff. I am really afraid of this because, unfortunately, with the current batteries, these cars can explode. Chevy actually took their bolts out of the market because so many exploded. And I don't have to tell you about Teslas. Today, even one of the biggest threats is we had 2 fires in buildings start in one day last week because of the electric scooters, where the scooters spontaneously combusted. Again, things to think about. This is an electric percent of vehicles. 30% of automobiles in the United States were powered by electricity. 40% in 1900 were powered by steam. Hey, throw some coal in the boiler so we can get down the street. And only 22% were powered by gasoline. Something to think about. In fact, Daimler's first vehicle was an electric car. This is a plate from a 99 model motor. That's a General Electric motor made in Schenectady, New York. Well, GE's no longer in Schenectady, no longer making motors for the most part. And this 99 vehicle, 1899, was, this is actually on a transformer. And of course, on the right is the B. Altman. If anybody is old enough to remember, there was a store across from Macy's called B. Altman. And B. Altman was a very, very luxury store. And they, in 1900, this is their electric truck. This was literally the way they moved stuff around New York City with an electric vehicle. Today, 120 years later, they're looking at, obviously thinking about it again. Maybe Elon Musk wasn't so creative after all. Whatever. It doesn't, remember, it's not the idea, it's the execution. And that's where you got to give guys credit. Of course, the execution is always based upon tax rebates, things to think about. Now, today, as we build buildings, we think about, do you have parking? People are going to ask, well, in Long Island City, they may not care whether you have parking or not. Other places, they'll say, look, I want to rent an apartment, and oh yeah, the parking's an extra $300 a month. So that goes into, and it can be a big part of the decision-making process of a renter. What else do we have? So again, these are all factors that go into city planning. And actually in Long Island City, because so many people are taking a car and bikes and Ubers, Uber has actually probably done more to reduce congestion, Uber has increased the number or reduced the number of cars owned, but then has increased congestion in New York City. So this is actually something zoning's trying to figure out how to tackle now. Of course, in non-urban areas outside the cities, we think about different issues. How to use parkland or conservation easements or watersheds or rivers. Non-urban areas, upstate New York, for instance, they may only care about, hey, save 20 feet for the sidewalk. Other than that, build whatever you want. Now, these 1880s, chances are, I don't think anybody's going to want to build a whole lot here. Because a lot of the areas, guys, if you go north of like Rockland County, so much of New York State is dying. And it's pretty amazing to see. Anyway, things to think about. Again, non-urban areas, they literally, in the 19th century, they literally figured out a way to draw a grid up. And if you've ever flown, I was flying out to Vegas recently, and you fly out over again, the township concept of much of the United States was that you would have a square mile, and the square mile would be divided up into 640-acre parcels. The 640-acre parcels divided by 4 by 4 divided by 16 is 40 acres. And not coincidentally, this was where the phrase 40 acres and a mule comes from. It was originally for both Civil War veterans and freed slaves. In most cases, many of the freed slaves never got their 40 acres and their mule. And thus, of course, good old Spike. And many did, many didn't, many had them stolen from them. But that's quite a challenge. And if you want a little reading on that, California today just put out a paper, which I have not read yet, about how to handle reparations for African Americans, freed slaves, et cetera. Whether that happens or not, that's going to be a political decision. But California, at least, is looking at doing something about it, whether that's right or wrong. Things to think about. But literally, we planned on just putting a square over the entire country. And of course, you're right. We look at areas like Ithaca, New York. What did they plan for? They planned for bars. Why? Because bars generate jobs. And bars, what do? They keep college students happy. Instead of IBM and steel industries in Ithaca, now the big industry is universities. And those universities, he said, we have to make people want to come here. So they rezoned the area more or less for a party district. Pretty good zoning. Other types of development tools in New York City is transfer of development rights. There's an example of a building where where a client would perhaps take the air rights from a lower building and transfer it by some legal covenants up to the top of another building. This unused development is pretty unique to New York. In fact, while I was teaching at Baruch a couple of years ago, we actually had a conference that people traveled from all over the world to study New York City's air rights and transfer of development rights laws. For apartments, the idea is pretty simple. You buy for $400 a square foot the guy who doesn't need it next door, and you build it on top. You've already bought your land, so it's almost free, and it's the top, so it becomes more valuable. So you might buy for $400 or $500 and sell for $5,000. That sounds pretty good. I don't know who this jerk is. Well, that's me about 20 years ago, and I was standing out about right there on the 43rd story of this building. And as you can see on Park Avenue, it was a lot taller than its buildings nearby, because when we calculated it, we were able to push the bulk of the building up. And also, the building behind was the lighthouse for the blind. And well, as we went up, and they didn't really need the view. I know, bad pun. And the top buildings at the time had great views of Central Park, as you can see from looking up Park Avenue in this picture. But later on, a bunch of buildings blocked the view. Ironically, the same developer that built the rights we didn't buy for this building, he bought it for another building across the street and built a very tall building that blocked the view of Central Park from this building. Another example of air rights transfers, this is a product I worked on in Times Square, where we bought the air rights from and cantilevered over a landmark theater. And by transferring their rights, they're a big one-story landmark theater, and we bought their air rights. And instead of going 30 stories, we went up to about 54 stories on this tower. And this one because they kind of sucked the air rights from the buildings around them. This is a great example, one I like, where recently, actually it took about 10 years to do, they built a really neat tower called Tour Vert, the Green Tower, over at 6th Avenue. But to do it, they transferred air rights all the way from 5th Avenue, 800 feet away, through an entire huge lot, which is mostly owned by the Rockefellers, commonly known as the Museum of Modern Art. And then they put it on this new tower all the way over at 6th Avenue, where most of the businessmen live. A big factor in the state. They and also can handle development rights transfers for parks. Example of a historic property. Again, it's kind of a slum in the 1940 tax pictures. Today, it's for sale for 25 million bucks. Go figure. Again, it's a landmark. You can't change it. You can't build on top of it. And you might be able to build on top of it. But again, quite an interesting owning. This is where you might plan an entire area at once. This is an area called Far Rockaway, Queens. You know, not the most sexy area of the city. But when it was actually built not as permanent homes, but as beach bungalows. So another house in the backyard, and then a little alleyway, then another house, and then the next street. So where you would normally have 2 houses, you have 4. So these bungalows were designed at very high density. But what made them happen, and also with it, they designed for commercial strips nearby and some higher density areas. And these came later, I think. But what really mattered for the cluster zoning, the cluster in New York City, in city planning, really up until the 80s, was what was the organizing factor? Sometimes it's transit, but at the time, the main organizing factor in the outer boroughs, like here in Queens, was actually the elementary school and the park. The elementary school and the park were the key elements because they were, obviously the idea is people used to have a lot of kids. So people had 5, 6, 7, 8 kids. And with that, that's a lot of kids running around. So the idea was a cluster would be set up so, and much of New York City's planning from the Robert Moses period on was that everybody would have a maximum of 1/4 mile to walk to the elementary school. Sounds rather passe, but in the day when everybody had a lot of kids, that was a good planning idea where you cluster the housing around an elementary school. Today, you cluster it around subways. Now, with planning, we look at things like the open meeting law. All these zoning changes have to be done in public. The open meeting law means every city planning meeting is recorded. In fact, you can even watch these on YouTube. A 9-hour BSA meeting will bore you to tears, or sometimes it's good background noise while you're working. In fact, understanding these things, like going to community board meetings, helps you understand as a broker what products will be there in the future. And if somebody has a design, you can actually go for the freedom of information law, like state, city, and federal, and ask why they're doing things. I had a freedom of information request recently. As a former borough commissioner, I knew exactly how to write it. And the department was very upset with me because I had asked them to publish a document that previously had been hidden called determinations. And I demanded that the city give me a full list of all the determinations that were provided. Well, it ended up, they didn't give me the way I wanted it. I did a favor to a friend and didn't ask for it anymore, but they did a favor and they actually put them all online now. So you can see determinations. Again, it took them a long time to get the data together, but they realized that it was very important public data, so they had to make it public. And there's amazing amounts of stuff on the New York City buildings work. In fact, of course, we saw tax records. They have to be public. Now, planning boards are an important zoning of it. Planning boards can be 2 or 3 people in a little town like Somers in New York, which is a very nice, I think, 17th, 18th century town. It's one of the most wealthy towns in the world. And it's also, they have very strict planning to keep very large lots, very few houses, and that keeps the value up. But they also have a big commercial component in the global headquarters of companies like PepsiCo or whatever it's called these days, Mondelez. Again, city planning, New York City, 13-member panel, they get together to decide a lot of stuff. Typical master plan you might see on, let's say, a college campus, where you see plan phase 1, phase 2, and the buildings will slowly build out over time. Now, with these master plans, you look at parking, sewers, solar, electricity, environment, as well as the plans for making the project work. These master plans can often be approved by a community or a city, but things matter. I mean, yes, today you're going to have 200 cars a day from driveway D, but in the future, you may have 2,000. So, well, we may make you pay for a widening of the road. So these are things that are part of the horse trading of public policies. Again, with subdivisions, there are a lot of rules they have to follow. Obviously, subdivisions are based upon the size of each individual lot, but you also think about the streets around them, their access to parking, their access to parks. These curvy things, these cul-de-sacs aren't just by coincidence. Those cul-de-sacs actually have a very important purpose. That's the turning radius of a fire truck. And that's actually a major deciding factor in a lot of urban planning. Can your fire trucks come in and navigate? Because if not, you ain't building, baby. And things to think about. In development, we think about pre-acquisition costs. We'll talk about more in the development section, but we think land options. You might not want to buy a property. You might be at an auction. You might want to decide to buy a 3-month option on it, where you can say, well, I could buy it for $1 million, but maybe instead I'm going to offer you not auction it, and I'll give you $50,000 if you let me have the option to buy it for $1 million 3 months from now. And that'll give me the chance to assemble money, perhaps come up with designs, and then I'll decide whether it's really smart to buy your property. But I've only spent that land option. For him, he's like, okay, I'll just wait around for another 3 months. And this guy's going to pay me $50,000 while he draws some pictures. Well, again, a developer buys time. The owner buys, and then he buys land. The buyer, the seller, of course, of the option is just like Wall Street. In fact, my MBA thesis was all about futures and options in real estate. It's ended up getting a little too legalese, these legal fees, environmental studies, feasibility studies. You might buy a property that you find out you can't build it for 5 years. Zoning and traffic studies, like all these things can happen as part of a large development. Again, development costs can be the land cost, the architect fees. There's a project I advised on 39th Street. They had plenty of money to demolish it. They poured the foundation, and then the lady ran out of money. So now what was going to be a 35-story hotel cantilevering out over the adjacent building is still a year later a hole in the ground. Again, when we think about development, the hard and soft costs, the hard costs of materials, labor, and contractor and subcontractor sections, security, telephone, cabling, millwork, changes, fines, stop work orders. That's one of the big ones in New York City. All these things have factoring in your cost. I once told the commissioner, he said, how much does it cost them a lot of money to have a stop work order? And I said, yeah, it costs $50,000 a day for a large project, at least. Today, that number is $100,000. And of course, the biggest element of all, hard and soft costs, but the biggest element is to look at, and we'll talk about this more in the M18 class, the cost of your equity. Are you getting a loan for 7% with a good construction loan, or are you going for hard money and they want 25%? Again, the cost of money itself is required to try to assess the property. Today, you might buy a house on a whim. You may not buy an investment property on a whim. Cost and maintenance costs of a building. Operating costs are actually about 90% of the cost of the building over its lifespan, even though construction might be expensive. These fees add up in the cost of a building. Conversely, they're all dumped back into a maintenance fee. You might buy a $1 million apartment and then find out that you are still paying $2,000 a month in your condo fee to pay for all the other expenses. And we saw that again in the HOAs in the suburbs, where you have your house, but you may pay $200 a month for the pool and the mowing, et cetera. Again, density pop to the zoning and development costs when you're building a building, particularly in New York City. In New York, the smallest lot is 1,700 square feet. In a lot of places, the smallest lot might be 5 acres. So that's in New York City, 0.04 acre versus 5 people live per square mile. Here you might have 100,000 people per square mile or 500,000 people per square mile. Here you might have 20. Again, transit, bikes, all these things actually hone in special districts where they changed the zoning to encourage growth. For instance, this area, as we talked about before, this in 1753, this area was outlined because it was called, these guys got their land the old-fashioned way. It was given to them by King George II. This is called Trinity Farm. Today, it's now called Hudson Square. Well, one of the problems with rezoning it a couple of years ago is most of the land is actually owned by, 250 years later, still owned by Trinity Church, Wall Street. This was the farmland 250 years ago to support the church. Today, it is supporting the church in spades because there are tens of billions of dollars of real estate. Now, the farm, just like they had leased out the farm for farming, they leased out the buildings for 99-year leases. People build a building, and 99 years later, or actually much earlier during the Depression, the church got the buildings back. So the church is now, instead of a major landowner, they're a major building. 100 square feet in New York City for the tiny lot, 17 by 100. Now you can do anything with it. This is an example of Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn. Lots and lots of houses all lined up. They're worth about $500,000 a piece. That's pretty nice. Of course, when we talk about how do you plan for New York City, but how do you plan for the whole 50-mile radius region? This is a quick reminder of the transport that feeds the region. Again, when we look at subdivisions, we think about how to plan the houses for water treatment, et cetera. Again, all the factors that go into planning go into zoning and land use. And to get a complex city like this that people want to copy, again, in real estate, you think about things like demographics. Who lives where? What kind of family are you going to be doing? Now, be careful. Don't use this as a tool for discrimination, but use it as a tool for developers. Use it for telling, what do I want to build in this area? So, for instance, in Southern Brooklyn, there's a lot of families, married couple families that probably have kids. In fact, a lot of these areas have this big dark blue area here is that area I mentioned called Borough Park. So they have a lot of many children families. And so that affects city planning. And one of the ironies here is there's a lot of families here, but most of the kids don't go to public schools. So that actually decreases the load for some of the planning factors. But other areas, there's a lot of single family households. So that may affect how you might design a property. Now, be careful though. If somebody has a voucher for $3,000 a month and they can afford a $3,000 a month apartment in Midtown Manhattan, don't even, if they want to see it, don't even think about saying, no, you don't want to live there. Be very careful. Do not tell them, do not steer people. Don't say the single family, the single mother family's got to live in the Bronx or out of Brooklyn. That will get you in a lot of trouble. In fact, in this area, the red areas, people are living alone, but very important not to discriminate in any way, just by steering by race, by family size or anything, okay? Let them choose. And if they've got the money to look at the place, let them look at it and show them just as you would any person. Very, very, very important to be to use demography trends to understand your markets, but also do not discriminate with data. Moratorium, this is where an area might say, oh, you can't build anymore. This is out in Jamaica, Queens, for instance, they can't moratorium because the new incoming people, Manhattan Beach is often referred to as Little Odessa. Odessa is unfortunately more famous for other reasons right now, but Odessa, the people moved in, a lot of doctors made a lot of money when they came to the United States, understanding how Medicaid worked. And a lot of these guys wanted to build huge houses in the style they would have had on the waterfront at Odessa in what is now Ukraine. And so the neighborhood people who were there before with smaller houses, they were like, oh, you can't do that. That's terrible. They were trying to get a moratorium because they were ugly. That's not the way it works. Moratoriums are only there for public welfare if there's a safety issue, okay? Overcrowding, infrastructure and scale, yes. Ugly. In New York City, we won't worry about those, the Board of Standards and Appeals. And lastly, when we talk about zoning variances, we think about these. A zone may make a special use permit to allow you to use something different. You go through a public hearing, you don't require hardship, but you just ask, and they'll decide whether you can use it. Alternatively, they may ask for variance, where it specifically says you can't do something, but let's say for use, you say, I've got a real hardship, I really need to do this, I've got a special lab I want to do. So the use variance they might give you, or they might let you build a house. This is the Borough Park idea where you're allowed to go and ask to build a larger house because you got a big family and you got 6 kids, and where they might change the zoning just for one person, and that's illegal. We've done about 2 minutes. Special permits, again, as I said, you got 2 factories and a guy wants to put a pizzeria in the middle. Well, pizzeria may not be allowed in this zone. It is in New York City, but that's another story. But you can see that's a complementary use. These guys in the warehouses, they need a place to eat. So, hey, pizzeria makes sense for use. Now, this lady goes to the city and says, look, I need not a special permit, but I need a variance. It says, the law says I cannot be a broker. I can't have my broker's office in my house. Well, I'm in a wheelchair, so I'd like a use variance to do it out of my house. By the way, this is illegal by New York State law, but just for concept, she wants to do a brokerage from her house. He's a scientist and does work all the time, so he wants to put a big greenhouse in his yard, and they may ask for an area variance. He needs it for work, so they say, okay, you can build it, but after you leave, it's got to be torn down. So that'd be an example because it maybe comes in, it just benefits one person at the detriment of others. In this case, without asking anybody, they change the zoning to these houses and make a big factory in the middle of it. There's an exact case of this with a wholesale furniture place in Coney Island, where a guy tried to do a rezoning and he's illegal, and he gets like a $50,000 in fines per year because of it. In this case, spot zoning, it's illegal by state law where they change just for space. These are buildings, as I said earlier, that may have a previous use. This is a wood frame building in Manhattan. Its grandfather, you would not be allowed to build after 1885. Great example is 425 Park Avenue. I was outside this morning. This is the old 425 Park Avenue. 1950s, kind of boring, not so fancy, but by a great architect, Pietro Bellucci, but it had an FAR of 25, but very narrow. It only had 10-foot floor ceilings. So that's kind of boring and very low ceilings. So instead, they said, we're going to tear this whole thing down 74% and then build it back up. And as we build the same floor area back up, it's going to be 300 feet taller. They literally spent $2 billion stretching this building. And as a result, they just finished a building that was the first building to break $200 a square foot in lease cost at 425 Park Avenue. But they literally took the old building and stretched it 300 feet using the grandfathered floor area and being able to continue it. Luckily, a commissioner gave them the variance and they got it. Again, illegal uses and non-conforming uses areas like the city's going to build a huge city out near the Willits Point area. Again, non-complying. Well, this guy, of course, this is Chinese. What happened if you build one too big? I had a guy build a third floor in Garrettson Beach. And I literally called him. I said, dude, you're not allowed to do this. You're not supposed to be up there. You got to fix it. And while I'm talking, he's talking about, well, similar to this one, that engineer, by the way, was a brilliant engineer, very old guy, smart as hell. And he knew every trick in the book, but he was wrong. And in fact, I had the guy take the top floor off the building. In this case, is in China. And this guy was supposed to stop at the dark black area. Instead, he built the extra couple floors thinking nobody would notice. What you don't see in this picture is just to the left is an excavator, because the Chinese local government don't play. They literally came up with an excavator and ripped those 3 floors off about 5 minutes later. Ouch. Unfortunately, they're in the same neighborhood in Jiangsu, province in Jiangsu. They're also doing this to all of the religious buildings, churches, synagogues, mosques, etc. And they're destroying all of them as well, because they're not allowed in that province. Again, sometimes because it's a local law, they can go to state court and challenge it. This was challenged in state court, and the people won a little bit of a reprieve, but a state appeals court said, no, the local jurisdiction is allowed to do what it wants for its zoning. But they changed the zoning, but made it happen. Part of zoning, we think about that universal land view where the city approves master plans. New York City, we look at rezonings of district, the new tower, which became the 30 FAR tower, which became One Vanderbilt. An even taller tower is proposed at the Hyatt building next to Grand Central. That's Grand Central right there. And of course, the Holy Grail is the monstrous building that's going to be built at 277 Park or 270 Park for JP Morgan. Again, professional services, when doing these, there's architects, engineers, landscape architects, et cetera. All of them have the play. And as we know, as we talked about earlier, zoning can be very powerful. And as we wrap up for the night, I mentioned, you can see Island, this is an area that's been rezoned, is now growing. Really, a bunch of these buildings after 20 years are finally happening. And Coney Island's going to be a neat place soon. Downzoning for Brighton Beach because of flooding. And they said, someday there's going to flood. Well, they stopped the rezoning and they prevented the building from losing value because you were allowed to build 15 stories, and suddenly they said you could build 3. And that made a lot of Russian mob, didn't say that. A lot of people not really happy. So they got the zoning stopped. And oh, by the way, it did flood 4 years later. Waterfront area, this is going to be the most important thing in the next 5 years. Taking an old, look at this old crappy, what the heck? It's 170 years old. Well, why don't you tear it down? No, instead we'll turn it into an apartment of buildings. This is an old warehouse in Williamsburg. Boom. Becomes a really cool hotel. And I had a client take me to a really cool dinner a couple of months ago. Again, we think about those zoning maps. This is your moneymaker. This changes. C628, that little change right there made people, well, that was actually an area called the Empire Stores, where somebody was able to lease a large chunk of land and make a lot of stores. Again, mixed use buildings one more time, thinking about those multiple uses, commercial stores off, transit center design is a big factor today. Again, designing for trains. This is the center of New York City's concept of zoning. If you're near a train, you make money. Lots of special situations. One of the things I like is rear lot buildings. I'm advising on one of these right now. These are leftovers from the 1870s, and some of them still exist. I just found some on 25th Street that are a bit of a problem. Again, there's special districts. Again, we looked through these already. Somewhat to repeat. And of course, the most important question of the night is, what is hanging? And so again, read the summary points at the end of the lecture. It's coming up on 10 o'clock. So best of all, everybody, please put your name one more time in the chat room. And here, send your email to slcconference@verizon.net and or copy me at skyscraperfoundry@gmail.com on the right side. And I'll make sure you get credit for the class. I hope you enjoyed. And I'm speaking too fast. We'll take questions if anybody's got any. And everybody, once you sign in, check in, you're more than welcome to drop off. Anybody got any questions?
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you
Brian,
so
can you hear
much.
me?
You're so welcome. Yes, I can hear you.
I actually sent you an email the other day. I don't know if you got it.
For attendance, I did.
No, not for attendance. I wanted to subscribe to your
I may have got it. Can you send it again?
Okay, I'll send you another email today.
Okay, sorry for the miss.
No
I'll
problem.
definitely look.
It probably
I'm
went
crazy.
to your
I'm
spam.
crazy.
I don't know.
Yeah, might have. I don't know. I've been pretty crazy. I've got some listings and some work I'm doing right now. So anybody questions
No.
out there? Okay, everybody, I got bad
I
news for
did,
you.
but I forgot. So if I
Well-
remember, I will send you an email.
That's great. And on that note, everybody, I got 2 words for you. What's my favorite 2 words? Sayonara.
Wait. Can you not end it real quick? I need to get the first code. It's all the way up. I gotta send it. Just give me a second.
Ah.
Okay. Have a good night. Thank you.
Okay, everybody. Do well, be well. Good luck on your studying. Kick some butt, and
All right, got it. Thank you.
take care, everybody. I'm out of here. Have a wonderful night.